Welcome to the COBIT 2019 Foundation Exam Preparation course. In this opening module, we will establish the foundational landscape of enterprise governance of information and technology and outline the road ahead for your certification journey. This course is an unofficial, independently produced guide. It is not affiliated with, endorsed by, or connected to ISACA in any way. All trademarks belong to their respective owners. This content is for informational and educational purposes only and does not guarantee results on your examination. If you are aiming to demonstrate a professional understanding of how modern enterprises manage their information technology assets, you have arrived at the right place. This course is designed to provide you with the exact knowledge required to navigate the COBIT framework and pass the ISACA Foundation exam on your first attempt. We strip away the unnecessary fluff and focus entirely on the core concepts that appear in the assessment. By the end of this curriculum, you will possess a structured understanding of how to align technology initiatives with business objectives, ensuring that your organization derives tangible value from its digital investments. The curriculum is structured across 8 logical chapters that follow the evolution and architecture of the COBIT framework. We begin by defining the distinction between governance and management, moving through the governance system components, and concluding with the practical application of system design factors. Each chapter builds upon the last, providing you with a systematic progression from abstract principles to actionable implementation strategies. You will learn how to parse the framework's terminology, which is essential for decoding the specific logic used in the exam questions. My objective is to provide a clear, technical roadmap that transforms a complex framework into a manageable mental model. Regarding the examination itself, it is a 75-question, multiple-choice, remote proctored test that requires a solid grasp of both conceptual theory and practical application. You will have 2 hours to complete the exam, which means time management is just as critical as your subject matter knowledge. To pass, you must demonstrate a deep understanding of the COBIT 2019 core principles, the Goals Cascade mechanism, and the various governance system components. Scoring is based on the number of correct responses, and there's no penalty for guessing, so it is imperative to answer every question presented. The exam is designed to test your ability to apply governance concepts to realistic enterprise scenarios. Mastering these concepts requires an understanding of how COBIT has evolved from its predecessors to address the realities of modern digital transformation. Today's enterprises face rapid technological change and pressure to be more agile, which is why the current framework is designed to be flexible and tailorable. We will explore how the framework balances the need for stability and reliability with the requirements of innovation and speed. It is important to remember that COBIT is not a prescriptive rulebook, but a comprehensive framework that you must adapt to the unique context of an enterprise. Developing this adaptive mindset is the primary key to both your exam success and your professional effectiveness. See you in the next lesson. Welcome to the first chapter of our exploration into enterprise governance of information and technology, where we will establish the fundamental baseline for everything that follows. In this section, we will define what governance really means in a modern enterprise and why it is not merely a bureaucratic preference, but a necessity for survival. Governance of information and technology is the system by which an organization is directed and controlled, ensuring that stakeholder needs, conditions, and options are evaluated to determine balanced, agreed-on enterprise objectives. When we talk about governance in the context of COBIT, we are moving beyond simple technical management to address how the enterprise achieves value from information and technology. This requires a robust framework that aligns business strategy with the underlying digital infrastructure while managing risk and optimizing resources. If an organization treats technology as a back-office support function rather than a core strategic driver, it will eventually face a disconnect between its market ambitions and its actual operational capabilities. By mastering these concepts, you will gain the ability to articulate why governance is the missing piece in many failed digital transformation attempts. Digital transformation has fundamentally altered how organizations create value, making formal oversight an existential requirement rather than a luxury. Without a governing body or process to oversee technological investments, enterprises often find themselves buried in technical debt or fragmented systems that do not serve the broader business goals. This is why we focus on EGIT, as it provides the mechanism required to bridge the gap between executive command and technical delivery. When you understand these principles, you will be able to help organizations navigate the complex landscape of digital trust, security, and competitive positioning. We will examine how governance acts as a filter, ensuring that resources are allocated to initiatives that provide the highest strategic value while rigorously filtering out activities that lead to waste. We must consider the real-world consequences of systemic governance failures to understand why this subject matters so deeply. When governance is absent or ineffective, the symptoms almost always manifest as operational disruptions, catastrophic data breaches, or aggressive regulatory penalties that can cripple a business. Reputational damage is perhaps the most difficult consequence to quantify, yet it often represents the largest long-term cost to an enterprise. You will learn how to identify these risks before they manifest, utilizing the frameworks we discussed to build a resilient structure that proactively manages accountability. By establishing clear lines of authority and transparent decision-making processes, an organization can transform its IT department from a cost center into a strategic partner that survives market volatility and regulatory scrutiny. I look forward to our next discussion as we dive into the specific benefits of this oversight. Welcome back. And today, we are focusing on the tangible benefits of enterprise governance of IT, or EGIT. In this session, we will explore why organizations commit resources to formal governance frameworks and how these structures translate into improved business outcomes. When we talk about the benefits of governance, we are essentially discussing the creation of a reliable feedback loop between the strategic goals of an organization and the technical operations that support them. Many organizations suffer from what I call the transparency gap, where capital investments in information technology seem to disappear into a black box without clear metrics regarding their return on investment. A formal governance model acts as a bridge, ensuring that every dollar spent on IT is traceable to a specific enterprise objective. By defining clear accountability and decision-making rights, governance removes the ambiguity that often plagues technical projects. When stakeholders know exactly who is responsible for a decision and how the success of that decision is measured, the entire organization moves with greater cohesion. It ceases to be a situation where the board asks for innovation while the technical teams are perpetually stuck in maintenance mode. Effective governance aligns the language of business strategy with the language of technical delivery, transforming IT from a mysterious cost center into a predictable engine of value. Operational risk management is perhaps the most immediate, observable benefit of adopting a robust governance framework. Without a governing structure, risks are often identified only after they have manifested as failures, such as a major data breach or a critical system outage. Governance forces these risks into the light during the planning and evaluation stages rather than the reactive remediation stage. By utilizing standard processes, an organization can maintain a consistent risk appetite across all departments, ensuring that the level of protection aligns with the sensitivity of the data being handled. This consistency is essential when dealing with the modern regulatory landscape, where laws like GDPR or various industry-specific security standards require demonstrable control over data processing. Governance provides the documentation and the audit trail needed to prove compliance, which is not just a legal requirement, but a fundamental defensive measure against reputational damage. When risk is treated as a manageable attribute of the business rather than an unpredictable event, the enterprise can operate with much higher confidence. Beyond risk, we must consider the significant impact that governance has on the economic efficiency of the enterprise. In many environments, fragmented IT processes leads to redundant capabilities, where different business units purchase the same cloud services or software licenses without ever coordinating for volume pricing or interoperability. Governance provides the oversight necessary for cost optimization by ensuring that infrastructure and application choices are evaluated for their utility across the entire enterprise. This doesn't mean stifling innovation. Rather, it means building a foundation where innovation can be scaled sustainably. When you are looking to integrate advanced technologies like artificial intelligence or decentralized cloud services, you need a stable architecture and a clear set of policies to guide the implementation. Governance provides the guardrails that allow your organization to experiment and pivot safely. knowing that the core systems remain robust. Achieving this kind of organizational agility is impossible if your technical foundation is chaotic, disjointed, or suffering from the high maintenance costs of undocumented workarounds. We also need to address the human element, which is the culture, ethics, and behaviors that are shaped by formal governance. When governance is implemented correctly, it moves away from being a heavy-handed bureaucratic hurdle and instead becomes a set of professional standards that guide how people interact with data and technology. It defines the expected level of competence and the ethical boundaries that govern professional conduct within the IT domain. This clarity helps in attracting and retaining talent, as professionals generally prefer working in environments where roles are well-defined and success is clearly mapped to performance metrics. Furthermore, it changes the internal dialogue. Instead of asking whether IT can complete a request, the dialogue pivots to how a request supports the overall strategic goals and how it impacts the risk profile of the business. This cultural shift, while difficult to quantify in a spreadsheet, is perhaps the most sustainable benefit of implementing a well-structured governance model. It creates a mature environment where technical excellence is not just encouraged, but expected and rewarded as a pillar of enterprise success. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. We are now going to explore the critical conceptual boundary between governance and management, as defined by COBIT 2019. In the world of corporate systems, the terms governance and management are frequently used interchangeably, yet they represent fundamentally distinct functional domains with separate responsibilities. Governance ensures that stakeholder needs, conditions, and options are evaluated to determine balanced, agreed-upon enterprise objectives to be achieved. It involves setting direction through prioritization and decision-making while monitoring performance and compliance against agreed-upon direction and objectives. Essentially, governance is the compass that keeps the organization heading toward the desired destination, ensuring that the enterprise as a whole remains aligned with its broader mission. It is primarily the realm of the board of directors or the highest level of executive oversight within an organization. This group does not concern itself with the daily technical minutia of software deployment or procurement workflows, but rather with the broader strategic intent and systemic risk appetite of the organization. By evaluating, directing, and monitoring, they create the guardrails within which the rest of the organization must operate. Management, on the other hand, is concerned with the operational execution required to realize the strategies set by the governance layer. Management plans, builds, runs, and monitors activities in alignment with the direction set by the governance body to achieve the enterprise objectives. While the governance layer defines the destination, the management layer is responsible for the vehicle, the route, and the day-to-day operation of the enterprise functions. This involves the tactical realization of objectives through complex processes and specific activities that transform strategic intent into tangible business value. A manager, for instance, focuses on resource allocation, project delivery timelines, and the operational stability of business services. They must ensure that the work being done stays within the parameters established by the board. Without this distinction, we often see organizations suffer from either governance that micromanages or management that lacks strategic coherence. When we look at the interaction between these two distinct areas, we observe a clear reporting and accountability structure. Governance sets the expectations and the performance targets, while management reports back on the realization of these targets. This feedback loop is essential for the governance body to understand if their direction is being effectively translated into action. If the management layer encounters obstacles that prevent them from achieving the strategic goals, this information flows upward so the governance layer can adjust its direction or priorities accordingly. It is a relationship of oversight rather than one of equal standing. Management is accountable to the governance layer, which in turn acts as a guardian of the stakeholders' interests. By maintaining this separation, an organization gains a structural safeguard against misalignment, ensuring that tactical activities do not drift away from the overarching enterprise strategy. Understanding this distinction is significant because it prevents common organizational failures where the focus remains entirely on operational speed at the expense of strategic control. If you have ever seen an IT department successfully ship code that has no relevance to the actual goals of the business, you have seen a breakdown in the governance and management boundary. In such cases, the management layer was likely focused purely on the build and run aspects, without the necessary evaluate and direct oversight from the governance level. Conversely, governance without effective management leads to high-level strategic documents that never manifest as actionable, measurable outcomes. COBIT 2019 forces us to acknowledge that these roles carry different mindsets, different sets of tools, and different timelines. Governance is often long-term and strategic, while management is frequently short-term, iterative, and tactical. As you progress through your studies, I encourage you to categorize the practices you encounter into either governance or management domains. When you review the core model, you will notice that the evaluate, direct, and monitor domain is distinct from the align, plan, and organize domain. This structural choice in COBIT is not accidental. It is a pedagogical reflection of this fundamental split. By keeping these domains separate in your mind, you will find it much easier to navigate the complexities of the framework and understand why certain activities belong in specific areas. It clarifies who is responsible for what, which is often the missing piece in enterprise alignment. Keep these roles distinct as you analyze the objectives we will discuss in the coming sections. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back to our journey through the foundational pillars of enterprise governance. Today, we will examine the historical trajectory and the architectural shift that brought us from the audit-centric origins of COBIT to the modern, agile framework we use today. If you look back at the origins of COBIT, you find a tool designed primarily for IT auditors who needed a structured way to evaluate controls. In its early days, the framework felt static and perhaps overly prescriptive, serving as a checklist for ensuring that technology systems were operating within defined boundaries. As the business world shifted toward rapid digital transformation and cloud-native environments, the rigid structures of legacy models began to show their seams. Industry drivers like increased regulatory pressure, the democratization of data, and the speed of software delivery required a governance approach that could adapt on the fly. We needed a model that did not just look back at what happened, but one that could reliably guide enterprise strategy into an uncertain future. This evolution was not merely superficial. It represented a fundamental reimagining of what an enterprise governance system should be. The transition from COBIT 5 to COBIT 2019 was a necessary response to these shifting business landscapes, where agility is no longer optional. While COBIT 5 provided a robust set of processes, many practitioners found it difficult to tailor to the unique needs of a specific enterprise. The architecture was somewhat monolithic, which made it feel overwhelming for organizations looking to implement governance in small, incremental steps. COBIT 2019 addresses this by adopting an open architecture model, which encourages integration with other industry standards like TIL, ISO, and TOGAF. By moving away from a single, static document to a more flexible and modular structure, ISACA allowed the framework to remain relevant in a world where technology shifts faster than traditional update cycles. This modular nature is central to the design factors concept, which is essentially the framework's answer to the one-size-fits-all criticism of its predecessors. Understanding the core structural changes in the latest release requires us to look at how terminology and design factors work in tandem. The introduction of design factors provides a pragmatic way to tailor the governance system to the specific context of an enterprise, such as its risk profile, threat landscape, and strategic intent. Instead of inheriting a generic set of objectives, you now use these factors to prioritize what actually matters to your specific organization. Furthermore, the architecture now explicitly separates the governance system from the management activities, clarifying who is responsible for directing the enterprise versus who is responsible for executing the operations. This clarity is crucial because it prevents the blurring of lines that often leads to governance failing in practice. By refining the language and tightening the focus, the framework has become a tool that practitioners can use to argue for budget, focus, and structural changes. The shift toward a continuous and flexible update model is perhaps the most significant change for long-term sustainability. In the past, major version releases were infrequent, meaning the framework risked becoming obsolete in the face of disruptive technologies like artificial intelligence or decentralized ledgers. The current approach treats the framework as a living body of knowledge that can be updated as best practices evolve without requiring a total overhaul. This shift away from fixed, massive publications toward manageable, updatable components allows your organization to keep pace with innovation while maintaining rigorous oversight. When you are implementing these components today, you are not just checking boxes against an outdated standard, but are building a dynamic system that can handle the complexity of a modern digital enterprise. This focus on long-term sustainability is exactly why this framework continues to dominate the IT governance landscape. See you in the next lesson. Welcome back, and let's dive into the core architecture of the COBIT 2019 product family. In this session, we will examine the specific documentation and tools that constitute the official governance framework. The COBIT 2019 product architecture is not merely a collection of random documents, but a structured hierarchy designed to support governance practitioners in tailored implementation. At the foundation of this hierarchy lies the COBIT 2019 framework, Introduction and Methodology, which establishes the basic terminology and the structure of the governance system. Complementing this is the COBIT 2019 Framework, Governance and Management Objectives Guide, which serves as your primary reference manual for the 40 core objectives. You can think of these as the technical specifications for an enterprise. They define the expected outcomes and the structural requirements for effective governance. A software engineer would not start building a complex distributed system without first referencing the architectural blueprints. And similarly, you should not approach organizational governance without knowing exactly which manual contains the necessary guidance for your specific constraints. By understanding how these documents interrelate, you gain the ability to navigate the complex landscape of enterprise IT governance without getting lost in abstraction. Beyond the foundational frameworks, the architecture incorporates specialized tools such as the COBIT 2019 Design Guide and the COBIT 2019 Implementation Guide. The Design Guide is particularly important because it provides the mechanism for tailoring your governance system to the unique needs of your specific enterprise, which is a departure from a one-size-fits-all approach. If you are working in a highly regulated banking environment compared to a startup, the Design Guide helps you prioritize which objectives require more rigorous controls. Meanwhile, the Implementation Guide offers a practical, phased approach to putting these governance structures into operation within an existing organizational culture. This is crucial because governance is only effective if it is integrated into the daily flow of technical and operational work. These documents work in concert to bridge the gap between abstract theoretical principles and the concrete, actionable implementation plans required for real-world deployments. It is also important to recognize the inclusion of the COBIT 2019 Design Guide Toolkit, which accompanies the printed manuals as a digital resource. This toolkit contains spreadsheets and structured templates that assist practitioners in conducting the necessary assessments during the design phase. You will find that these resources are designed to reduce the cognitive load involved in mapping enterprise goals to governance objectives. When you are studying for the foundation exam, keep in mind that the examiners expect you to understand the relationship between these components. For instance, knowing when to reach for the design guide versus the implementation guide is a fundamental competency for an ISACA practitioner. The ecosystem of these publications is meant to provide a path from the initial conceptual understanding of governance values all the way to the ongoing monitoring of performance. You should view these manuals as authoritative references that you will continuously revisit throughout your career to ensure your governance decisions remain consistent with global best practices. I will see you in the next lesson. Welcome back. Today we are starting a crucial chapter where we look at how COBIT acts as an umbrella to integrate various industry standards into a cohesive enterprise governance ecosystem. We will explore how to synthesize disparate frameworks to drive organizational value without redundant effort. In the modern enterprise, it is rarely the case that an organization relies on a single methodology to manage its complexity. We often find ourselves in situations where IT service management is handled by ITIL, project management follows PRINCE2 or PMBOK, and information security is governed by ISO IEC 27001. If we treat these as isolated silos, we inevitably create friction, conflicting priorities, and a massive overhead of redundant compliance activities. COBIT 2019 is architected precisely to solve this by providing an overarching structure that sits above these specialized frameworks. By positioning COBIT as the integrative layer, we move away from the dangerous mindset that these frameworks are competing alternatives. Instead, We treat COBIT as the source of governance objectives that inform the operational requirements of service management, architecture, and project delivery. This shift allows us to harmonize high-level governance intent with the granular practices needed for daily execution. Consider the relationship between COBIT and ITIL-4, which is one of the most common pairings in large organizations. While ITIL provides the detailed practices for digital service management and value stream mapping, COBIT provides the governance logic that determines why those services exist and how they align with business objectives. When we align these, we avoid the trap of implementing ITIL processes simply for the sake of following a manual with no clear governance outcome. Similarly, when we look at ISO IEC 27001, we are dealing with a rigorous standard that demands specific security controls and management system evidence. COBIT bridges the gap here by mapping these security requirements to its own governance and management objectives, ensuring that the security program isn't just a technical exercise, but a component of enterprise value creation. The goal is to ensure that when we audit or assess our performance, we are checking the health of the entire system, rather than ticking off dozens of disconnected checklists. Enterprise architecture and project management frameworks like TOGAF and Prince2 further benefit from this structural alignment. TOGAF offers a robust methodology for developing enterprise architecture, but it requires the governance oversight that COBIT consistently provides through its design factors and goal-setting mechanisms. If we implement TOGAF without a governance framework, we often see architectural artifacts that do not actually serve the strategic direction of the board. By integrating these, we ensure that architectural decisions are effectively evaluated, directed, and monitored against the firm's defined risk appetite and strategic goals. This approach extends to Agile and DevOps environments as well, where the rapid, iterative nature of development can sometimes conflict with traditional oversight. COBIT recognizes these delivery models by providing a flexible framework that supports velocity while maintaining the necessary checks and balances to prevent operational drift. The practical implementation of this alignment revolves around mapping high-level objectives to functional controls. We do not try to replace the specialized knowledge in ITIL or PMBOK. Rather, we contextualize them using the COBIT governance and management objectives. When you are operating in a multi-framework environment, you must determine which controls are required by the business and then find which framework provides the most efficient way to deliver those controls. This mapping process eliminates the redundancy of reporting and assessment because you are essentially creating a single source of truth for the entire governance system. It requires a deep understanding of what each external framework contributes and how it supports the overarching governance structure. By focusing on the integration of these models, you significantly reduce the operational friction that plagues many large organizations today. As we conclude this session, remember that your task is to ensure the governance system remains a cohesive entity integrated with all other operational frameworks. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome to this module where we explore the 6 core principles that form the foundation of a robust enterprise governance system. We will dissect how these principles guide the design and implementation of governance to ensure technology truly supports business objectives. The first principle focuses on providing stakeholder value, which is essentially the primary requirement for any governance framework. We achieve this by balancing the realization of benefits, the optimization of risk, and the prudent use of resources. Think of it as a constant calibration exercise where you weigh the potential upside of an investment against the inherent risks and the finite capacity of your organization. When you ignore one of these 3 levers, the entire value proposition tends to collapse under the weight of either excessive risk-taking or anemic benefit realization. It requires a disciplined, ongoing assessment rather than a one-time decision, as the environment in which the enterprise operates is rarely static. You must treat this as a continuous feedback loop that aligns technical activities with the broader financial and operational goals of the organization. Next, we address the holistic approach, which discourages the tendency to treat governance as a fragmented checklist of activities. COBIT 2019 views a governance system as a collection of interacting components, including processes, organizational structures, policies, and culture. If you attempt to improve one component without considering its ripple effect on others, you will likely encounter unintended consequences that diminish your overall effectiveness. Managing these components in isolation often leads to friction, where, for instance, a rigid policy might stifle a high-performing team or a new technical structure might lack the necessary cultural support to function properly. Therefore, your design must be systemic, treating the interaction between these elements as the primary point of control. By focusing on how these components integrate, you create a stronger, more resilient architecture that is better equipped to adapt to internal and external stressors. Third principle is the requirement for a dynamic governance system that reacts to design inputs relevant to the organization. A static, off-the-shelf governance system is usually doomed to failure because it ignores the specific context of the entity it is meant to serve. When any design factor changes, such as the threat landscape, the regulatory environment, or the internal business model, the governance system must be flexible enough to adjust accordingly. This is not about constantly tearing down the structure and starting over, but rather about having a responsive mechanism that allows parameters to shift in light of new information. If your design remains rigid while the enterprise evolves, the governance framework will eventually become an obstacle rather than an enabler of business strategy. Constant vigilance ensures that your system stays current and relevant to the actual needs of the enterprise. Distinguishing governance from management is perhaps the most fundamental principle, yet it is frequently misunderstood in industrial practice. Governance is the role responsible for setting the direction, making decisions based on stakeholder needs, and monitoring performance against set objectives. Management, on the other hand, is the engine that plans, builds, runs, and monitors activities in accordance with the direction set by governance. Mixing these roles is dangerous because it muddies the waters of accountability and often leads to decision-making at the wrong levels of the organization. By keeping these functions separate, you ensure that there is an objective oversight body capable of holding operational staff accountable for results. It is the perennial difference between deciding where the ship is going and actually steering the vessel through the water. Tailoring to enterprise needs means that no two governance architectures should look exactly alike unless the organizations themselves are identical in every relevant detail. You should look at factors such as the size of the enterprise, its risk appetite, and the complexity of its technology stack to customize the governance model. This principle warns against the fallacy of adopting a global standard without filtering it through the lens of your own unique situation. Tailoring allows you to strip away unnecessary complexity while reinforcing the controls that actually move the needle for your specific business case. In effect, it turns a generic framework into a bespoke solution that fits the specific contours of your operational realities. This avoids wasting effort on controls that provide little value while ensuring that critical gaps are addressed with precision. Finally, the end-to-end principle demands that governance encompasses the entire organization and every instance of information and technology, regardless of where or how it is deployed. It is no longer acceptable to manage technical silos separate from enterprise-wide governance, as shadowed IT or unmonitored digital assets are prime sources of enterprise risk. By applying governance across the whole organization, you break down the artificial boundaries between IT and the lines of business that rely on it to function. This ensures that every piece of information and every technology asset is subjected to the same rigorous criteria for value, risk, and resource management. It is a unifying concept that brings technical execution under the same tent as strategic decision-making, ensuring total visibility for those responsible for oversight. Failure to view the enterprise as an end-to-end ecosystem invariably creates blind spots that attackers or systemic inefficiencies can exploit to the detriment of stakeholders. We will continue our exploration of COBIT frameworks in the next session. Welcome back. Today, we transition into the foundational logic that sustains a robust governance framework, specifically looking at how we construct the backbone of any management system. When we approach the structural integrity of a governance framework, we must first understand the necessity of being based on a conceptual model. This principle is not merely academic. It serves as the glue that ensures internal consistency across the entire governance architecture. Without a unified model, disparate governance requirements tend to drift apart, creating silos that prevent information from flowing correctly between management objectives. By grounding every component in a shared conceptual model, we ensure that terms, definitions, and relationships remain constant throughout the organization. Think of it as defining a shared domain language in a code base, where ambiguity is systematically removed to prevent integration errors. This clarity allows practitioners to navigate complex management systems, knowing that the underlying logic remains predictable and logically sound regardless of the specific area of focus. The principle of being open and flexible is equally critical, as an enterprise is never a static entity. A governance framework that is too rigid will inevitably fail when the business pivots or when new regulatory demands suddenly emerge. Being open means the framework is designed to allow for the modular addition of new content, focus areas, or even entirely new governance domains without necessitating a complete rewrite of the existing structure. If you have ever worked with a system designed for high extensibility, you know that the secret lies in separation of concerns and well-defined interfaces between components. This allows governance teams to integrate emerging technologies, such as artificial intelligence or cloud-native operations, into the management system as seamless extensions. By remaining flexible, the framework evolves at the speed of the business itself, rather than acting as a bureaucratic drag on organizational agility. Finally, we must address the requirement for the framework to be fully aligned with major standards. In the modern globalized economy, enterprises operate under a complex web of requirements, ranging from regional privacy laws to international quality management certifications. If a governance framework mandates structural requirements that conflict with these external mandates, the resulting complexity often leads to non-compliance or significant operational overhead. Therefore, alignment is not just about keeping the board happy. It is about ensuring that the internal governance system mirrors established global best practices. This integration allows for easier adoption of third-party audits and certifications, as the organization is inherently speaking the same language as the auditors. By staying compatible with standards from organizations like ISO or various industry-specific bodies, we create a system that is robust against external disruption and highly efficient in its compliance reporting. I look forward to our next discussion on how these elements coalesce within our practice. Welcome to the chapter on focus areas, where we will examine how COBIT 2019 achieves the necessary flexibility to remain relevant in a rapidly changing technological landscape. By the end of this module, you will understand how to customize the core governance framework to fit specific operational contexts without losing the integrity of the foundational model. In the world of governance, a one-size-fits-all approach is rarely the path to success, which brings us to the concept of focus areas. A focus area represents a specific governance topic, domain, or issue that can be addressed by a set of governance and management objectives and their underlying components. Think of the core COBIT framework as the stable, foundation-level reference architecture that remains constant across any organization. Focus areas, however, act as modular plugins that you can activate when your governance system needs to deal with particular challenges like cloud migration, cybersecurity, or agile development. By keeping these separate from the core, ISACA ensures that the primary framework remains lean and maintainable while still providing deep, expert-level guidance for niche areas. This architectural choice prevents the framework from becoming bloated with too many requirements that might not apply to every enterprise at every point in time. The beauty of the focus area design lies in its ability to bundle specific objectives that target unique industry trends or operational goals. When you implement a focus area, you are essentially adopting a pre-packaged subset of governance processes, organizational structures, and information flows that have been vetted for that specific domain. For instance, the focus area for DevOps practices helps an organization integrate continuous delivery pipelines into their governance system without forcing them to manually map every single governance objective to their agile workflow. This does not replace or rewrite the underlying core model, but instead enriches it by providing tailored context for the chosen area of concern. It is a practical application of the principle that governance must be dynamic, allowing practitioners to pivot as the business strategy shifts or as new risks emerge. When you adopt these, you are leveraging the collective knowledge of the industry for specific, well-defined scenarios. Currently, ISACA provides a range of published focus areas that cover high-priority topics. and this list is designed to grow as technology evolves. Examples include governance for small and medium enterprises, where the focus is on scaling processes to maintain effectiveness with limited resources, and information security, which requires deep integration with specific threat modeling and protective controls. There are also guides for information technology risk, ensuring that risk management is not just an overlay, but part of the core decision-making loop. Furthermore, the development of focus areas regarding the digital transformation journey or specific regulatory environments demonstrates how the framework matures alongside contemporary industry needs. You should view these as supplementary guidance that offers the granularity required to transition from foundational principles to actionable scenario-based implementation. They are essentially pre-configured shortcuts that allow you to effectively address complex, multifaceted business topics using the familiar COBIT vocabulary and structural components. When we analyze how these areas interact with the core framework, we must acknowledge that they do not exist in a vacuum. Instead, they operate by applying the base reference architecture through a specific lens, enabling you to select and weight the governance objectives that matter most for your target domain. If you are operating in a highly regulated environment, for example, the focus area for information security will dictate that you pay closer attention to specific objectives related to compliance and monitoring, even if your enterprise goals are broader in scope. This keeps the governance structure coherent, as you are still speaking the same language of COBIT, even when dealing with the high-level complexity of modern technological deployment. Ultimately, this approach empowers IT and business leaders to configure a governance system that feels custom-built for their unique reality. Without this modularity, the framework would risk being either too superficial to be useful or too cumbersome to be manageable. See you in the next lesson. Welcome back, and let's turn our attention to the Goals Cascade mechanism, the structural heartbeat of COBIT 2019 that transforms vague business ambitions into concrete IT reality. This foundational session explains how stakeholder needs filter through a hierarchical model to inform every strategic decision you make within the enterprise. If you consider how most organizations drift into technical debt or misaligned projects, you will find it is almost always due to a lack of a clear line of sight from the top down. The Goals Cascade is the antidote to this fragmentation because it forces an explicit translation of high-level stakeholder drivers into measurable results. We start at the very top of the hierarchy with stakeholder drivers and needs, which represent the external pressure or internal desires shaping the enterprise. Stakeholder needs are complex and often conflicting, so they must be synthesized into a manageable set of priorities. These needs act as the primary input that dictates what the enterprise must accomplish to remain viable and competitive in its specific market. Without this mechanism, IT often operates in a vacuum, focusing on technical excellence rather than business value. Once we have identified those high-level desires, we proceed to determine specific enterprise goals. These are not technical objectives, but rather business-centric outcomes that the organization must achieve to satisfy the identified stakeholder needs. For example, if a primary stakeholder need is risk management, the corresponding enterprise goal might be the stability of business services or the compliance of digital assets. We essentially map the qualitative needs into quantitative, or at least semi-quantitative enterprise-level metrics. This step is critical because it bridges the gap between the boardroom and the server room without getting lost in jargon. The enterprise goals provide the objective context for everything else we choose to govern or manage. With enterprise goals firmly in place, the cascade moves downward to alignment goals, which are essentially the bridge between enterprise strategy and IT capability. These goals relate specifically to the role of IT and how it must support the enterprise objectives we defined in the previous stage. If our enterprise goal is to achieve business outcomes through digital transformation, our alignment goal becomes the optimization of IT-enabled business processes. This is where we start discussing the effectiveness of IT services, the reliability of data, and the security of infrastructure. The alignment goals are the intermediary layer that ensures IT is not just busy, but actually productive in ways that matter to the business. Finally, the cascade terminates at the governance and management objectives, which are the most granular level of the entire model. These are the actionable activities our teams perform daily to ensure that the previously defined alignment goals are met. By the time we reach this level, the linkage back to the original stakeholder need is distinct and defensible. When a developer or an IT manager justifies why a specific process control is necessary, they're not citing a vendor recommendation, but a direct requirement flowing from the strategic goals cascade. This traceability is exactly what allows us to move from a cost center mentality to a value creation framework. It is a linear journey from intent to execution. See you in the next lesson. Welcome to our focused look at the 13 core enterprise goals established within the COBIT 2019 framework. We will examine how these goals function as the primary drivers within the goals cascade and why they are essential for aligning business strategy with IT operations. In the COBIT 2019 framework, the 13 enterprise goals act as a structured translation layer between the mission of an organization and the specific activities of its IT function. These goals are not merely abstract ambitions, they are distinct, actionable outcomes that an enterprise must achieve to realize its business strategy. By breaking these down into the standard balanced scorecard perspectives, financial, customer, internal, and learning, the framework ensures a holistic view of the enterprise. For example, a goal like portfolio of competitive products and services reflects a customer-oriented focus, while managed business risk leans heavily into the internal operations and stability category. Understanding this mapping is critical because it forces you to acknowledge that IT does not exist in a vacuum, but must respond to the specific, evolving needs of the wider business ecosystem, as defined by these categories. The beauty of categorizing these goals into balanced scorecard perspectives lies in the inherent balancing act of corporate strategy. If an organization prioritizes financial transparency, it simultaneously creates a constraint on the appetite for speculative product development. When you analyze a business case using COBIT, you are essentially determining which of these 13 goals have the highest priority in the current corporate climate. If the strategy leans toward growth, goals such as product and business innovation or managed digital transformation will naturally rise to the top. Conversely, a stable, legacy-heavy industry may prioritize managed business risk or quality of financial information. You must learn to read these goals not as a static list, but as a dynamic menu where prioritizing one often necessitates the careful management of another. Effective governance requires more than just identifying an objective. It requires the ability to measure progress toward that goal through concrete metrics. COBIT provides built-in metrics for each of these 13 enterprise goals, allowing practitioners to quantify progress and justify investments in IT initiatives. Imagine a scenario where management is concerned about their competitive edge in a digital marketplace. By selecting the goal related to managed digital transformation, you can identify specific metrics that track service adoption or customer-facing interface availability. These metrics serve as the bridge between technical performance and business value, ensuring that your governance system remains sensitive to real-world outcomes. Without this link, governance becomes an administrative overhead instead of a value creation engine. When interpreting the mapping tables provided in the framework, you are essentially translating business intent into IT objectives. The mapping table links each enterprise goal to various alignment goals, which in turn map to specific governance and management objectives. This cascading flow is the engine of the COBIT framework, ensuring that every penny spent on technology is traceable back to an enterprise strategy. In practice, this means that if you are asked to select the most appropriate G&M objectives for a specific business requirement, you must start by identifying the relevant enterprise goal first. If the goal is, for instance, staff retention, you look for the corresponding alignment goals that support organizational learning and growth. This disciplined approach removes guesswork and grounds your governance decisions in the actual needs of the enterprise. Prioritizing these goals during the system design phase is where the theory truly meets the pavement of implementation. Each enterprise will have a different weighting for these goals based on its unique context, industry regulations, and risk appetite. A highly regulated financial institution will inherently weight managed business risk far higher than an agile startup focusing on speed to market. Your role as an architect of the governance system is to facilitate the selection and weighting of these goals with key stakeholders. Using the framework as a common language allows you to move beyond opinions and discuss trade-offs in a structured, objective manner. When you align your governance efforts with these validated goals, you increase the likelihood that it will be viewed as a strategic partner rather than a cost center. I look forward to seeing you in the next session as we delve into the next topic. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will examine the 13 alignment goals, which serve as the crucial connection between high-level business strategy and the pragmatic execution of information and technology operations. Alignment goals are the middle layer of the COBIT 2019 Goals Cascade, functioning as the bridge between what the enterprise wants to achieve and how the IT department must perform to support those ambitions. You can view these goals as the translation mechanism that converts abstract executive expectations into specific technical outcomes. If the enterprise goals are the what of the business, the alignment goals are the how for information and technology. By focusing on these 13 specific dimensions, leadership can ensure that technical resources are not spent on interesting but irrelevant projects. Instead, these goals force a discipline where every IT investment, process, and asset is scrutinized for its contribution to broader corporate success. Without this linkage, the IT organization often descends into technical debt or silos, where systems are maintained for their own sake rather than for the value they generate for the stakeholders. The 13 goals are partitioned into several categories that reflect the various ways IT contributes to the business, starting with direct value creation and moving through risk and compliance. For instance, when we talk about the security of digital information, we are addressing the need to maintain integrity and availability under pressure, which is an alignment goal that almost every modern organization must satisfy. Simultaneously, we look at the optimization of INT assets, which relates to the cost-effectiveness and lifecycle management of our infrastructure and software. Compliance with external regulations is another pillar, ensuring that technical operations align with the legal and ethical requirements imposed by the industry or government. These are not merely suggestions, they are strategic focal points that allow an organization to weight their efforts based on the specific enterprise requirements. By selecting and prioritizing from these 13 goals, an architecture team can effectively ignore non-essential tasks and focus on those that carry the highest enterprise impact. To make this practical, imagine an organization that has identified its primary enterprise goal as the maintenance of competitive advantage through rapid product innovation. The goals cascade would dictate that the IT department prioritize alignment goals related to the agility of platforms and the reliability of development environments. If you were only measuring uptime, you might satisfy a generic IT goal, but you would be failing to support the business-critical need for innovation speed. This is why the selection and weighting process is so fundamental. It forces a deliberate alignment between the technical performance of systems and the unique strategic position of the enterprise. You essentially map your current technical capabilities against these alignment goals to identify gaps. If a particular alignment goal is under-indexed, the organization is effectively choosing to underinvest in that area, which provides a clear audit trail for why certain systems might be neglected in favor of others. As you progress through the framework, remember that these goals act as a compass for the design of the governance system itself. When we move later into discussing governance objectives or system components, you will constantly refer back to these alignment goals as the justification for why certain processes exist. For example, if your organization prioritizes the alignment goal of security of information, your choice of governance components might lean heavily toward mature policies and strict monitoring structures. Conversely, an organization prioritizing agility might favor decentralized processes and flexible infrastructure models that allow for quicker experimental iterations. By understanding these 13 alignment goals today, you are essentially laying the groundwork for the more complex design decisions you will need to make during the implementation phase. Treat these goals as the requirements for your governance system, because that is exactly what they are in the COBIT 2019 architecture. I will see you in the next lesson. Welcome back. Today, we are stepping into the core model of COBIT 2019 to understand how the framework organizes governance and management objectives into a functional structure. This chapter provides the essential map for navigating the operational heart of the framework, ensuring you can systematically apply its 40 objectives to your enterprise's unique requirements. The COBIT 2019 core model serves as the central engine for the framework, acting as the primary repository for governance and management objectives that an enterprise must execute. At its most granular level, this model consists of 40 distinct objectives, each specifically designed to address a particular aspect of enterprise information and technology management. These objectives are not merely arbitrary lists, but are structured to align directly with the governance and management processes that occur within a functional organization. When you examine a core objective, you are essentially looking at a process that requires explicit governance oversight or management execution to yield the desired business outcomes. Understanding this one-to-one mapping between objectives and processes is foundational for any candidate preparing for the examination, as it prevents the confusion often caused by thinking of these as separate conceptual entities. By internalizing that these 40 building blocks are the primary levers for creating value, you simplify the complexity of the framework into a manageable set of operational goals. To avoid being overwhelmed by 40 individual components, COBIT organizes these objectives into 5 distinct lifecycle domains that reflect the natural flow of operations within an enterprise. These domains are evaluate, direct, and monitor, which forms the governance layer, followed by 4 management layers known as align, plan, and organize, build, acquire, and implement, deliver, service and support, and finally, monitor, evaluate, and assess. The governance domain sits at the top, focusing on the strategic alignment of I&T with enterprise needs, while the 4 management domains handle the tactical and operational fulfillment of those strategies. Each domain groups objectives that share a common lifecycle phase, making it easier to see how an objective relates to the broader goal of planning, building, running, or monitoring technology assets. As you move through the curriculum, you will see how this domain-based structure creates a logical roadmap, allowing you to trace the lifecycle of technology from initial conception to final monitoring and performance assessment. This segmentation is crucial not just for passing the exam, but for understanding how different parts of an organization must interact to sustain a robust governance system. When you look at the official COBIT 2019 reference material, you will notice that every one of these 40 objectives follows a standardized format that includes a specific purpose statement and associated components. The purpose statement is your most important tool, as it clearly defines the intent and the primary value proposition of the objective in plain language. Beneath this statement, you will find a breakdown of how the objective relates to the various process components, including necessary roles, activities, and metrics. Learning to read these reference sheets effectively involves identifying how the specific inputs and outputs of a process provide the necessary evidence for successful governance. You should practice navigating these sheets to locate the process activities quickly, as the examination often tests your ability to associate specific activities with their corresponding management objectives. By understanding the general layout and the consistent terminology used across all 40 objects, you gain the ability to parse any part of the framework even if you encounter a scenario you have not explicitly memorized. This systematic consistency is the hallmark of a mature framework and is exactly what allows enterprise architects to implement COBIT across diverse organizational cultures. I look forward to our next discussion as we begin analyzing the specific domains. Welcome back. Let's explore the strategic heart of the COBIT framework through the evaluate, direct, and monitor domain. In this session, we will dissect the 5 governance objectives that define how boards exert oversight over the enterprise. The evaluate, direct, and monitor domain, commonly referred to as EDM, sits above the management layers as the ultimate mechanism for accountability. When we discuss governance, we are referring to the exercise of authority to ensure that stakeholder needs, conditions, and options are evaluated to determine balanced, agreed-upon enterprise objectives to be achieved. It implies setting direction through prioritization and decision-making, and monitoring performance and compliance against those agreed-upon objectives. You can think of the board or governing body as a compass and a controller, constantly checking if the business is steering toward its intended destination. Without this layer, management processes may operate efficiently, but remain fundamentally misaligned with the strategic intent of the organization. Because these 5 objectives form the mandate of governance, They are non-negotiable for anyone looking to pass the foundation exam or implement a robust control environment. We begin with EDM 01, which focuses on ensuring governance framework setting and maintenance. This objective is the foundation upon which all other processes rest, requiring the governing body to specify the approach to governance. It mandates selecting components of the governance system, defining how they interact, and consistently monitoring their ongoing fitness. If you imagine building a house, this is the architectural blueprint that dictates where the load-bearing walls must go to maintain structural integrity. Establishing this framework involves aligning with the enterprise's mission and ensuring that governance systems are not just static documents, but living components that evolve. Effective maintenance implies a feedback loop where the framework is reviewed periodically to ensure it remains relevant in the face of changing regulations, technology shifts, or market volatility. Moving into EDM 02, we address managed benefits delivery, which bridges the gap between investment and value realization. In a mature organization, every IT project or initiative must justify its existence through tangible contributions to enterprise goals. The governing body must ensure that these investments are not merely executed, but that they yield the intended output. This is not just about financial return on investment. It involves evaluating the portfolio of IT-enabled investments to ensure they cover the necessary scope and balance of risk. We direct management to monitor the progress of these benefits throughout the entire life cycle of an initiative. If a project enters the pipeline but fails to provide value, the board must have the data-driven authority to redirect resources or terminate the effort, thereby preventing the waste of precious enterprise assets. Risk management is the subject of EDM 03, or Managed Risk Optimization, which dictates that the governing body defines the enterprise risk appetite and tolerance levels. Governance is not about eliminating risk, as that would essentially halt all innovation and growth, but rather about managing risk within acceptable boundaries. We evaluate the risk environment to understand what factors could derail our strategy, then direct management to implement appropriate controls that bring residual risk in line with stakeholder expectations. The core task here is to maintain a constant awareness of the risk profile, ensuring that management is not taking excessive risks to meet short-term gains while exposing the company to existential threats. This requires transparent reporting structures where the board receives early warnings about emerging risks, allowing them to adjust directives before those risks materialize into critical failures. Resource management, covered under EDM 04, involves the optimization of talent, infrastructure, and information assets. The governance layer must ensure that there are adequate resources to achieve strategic goals while simultaneously preventing excessive expenditure. This is a delicate balancing act that requires the governing body to monitor resource utilization rates and efficiency metrics across the entire enterprise. We direct management to align the resource strategy with the overall business demand to ensure that bottlenecks are identified and addressed proactively. By evaluating the capacity and capability of current assets, a board creates a sustainable environment where technical debt is minimized and staff are sufficiently skilled to perform their roles. It is an exercise in resource stewardship, ensuring that the enterprise does not merely survive, but thrives through the intelligent allocation of its core assets. Finally, EDM 05 focuses on managed stakeholder engagement, acknowledging that governance cannot succeed in a vacuum. The governing body must identify all key stakeholders, both internal and external, and ensure their needs are accurately reflected in the governance objectives. This is not a passive activity. It requires proactive communication and the establishment of clear reporting mechanisms that keep stakeholders informed and invested. We evaluate the effectiveness of engagement strategies to see if they foster trust and alignment between the board and the various parties affected by enterprise decisions. Directing management to maintain productive relationships ensures that expectations are managed openly and that feedback is integrated back into the decision-making loop. When stakeholders feel heard and understand the rationale behind strategic shifts, they are far more likely to support the long-term changes proposed by the governance structure. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Let's dig into the strategic heart of the COBIT framework. In this lesson, we will explore the align, plan, and organize domain and how it bridges the gap between business intention and technical execution. The align, Plan and Organize domain, commonly abbreviated as APO, represents the tactical planning phase within the COBIT management objectives. While governance sets the direction, APO is where we design the blueprints for how that governance will manifest in our daily operations. It requires us to look at the enterprise as a holistic ecosystem where technology is not an isolated silo, but a fundamental enabler of business strategy. If you think about building a house, this domain encompasses everything from the architectural drawings to the procurement of materials and the assessment of potential structural risks. Without these planning activities, you are essentially trying to build infrastructure without a map, which is a recipe for technical debt and misalignment. We cover 14 specific management objectives here, each intended to ensure that the enterprise's investment in information and technology delivers tangible value rather than just overhead. We start our analysis with APO L1, which focuses on the management framework for I&T. This is essentially the blueprint for how you structure your IT organization and ensure that management processes are consistently applied across the enterprise. It forces us to ask how we maintain a unified approach to information and technology, preventing the fragmented, ad hoc decision-making that plagues many large organizations. Following this, APO02 pushes us to manage strategy by aligning current technological capabilities with future business requirements. It is not enough to simply react to requests. You must understand the long-term roadmap of the business and ensure that your technology stack supports that vision. If your business strategy changes, your IT strategy must shift in tandem, or you will find yourself providing solutions for problems that no longer exist. Architecture is the silent backbone of any enterprise, which brings us to APO03, the management of enterprise architecture. This objective is about creating a structured model that explains how data, applications, and technology interact within the organization. When we design this architecture, we are effectively setting the rules of engagement for every new system purchase or development project. By maintaining a clear architecture, we minimize complexity and ensure that new components integrate seamlessly into the existing environment. Complexity is the enemy of efficiency, and good architectural planning is the most effective antidote we have available. We also look at managing innovation in this domain, which requires a deliberate process for evaluating new technologies before they are pushed blindly into the production environment. Risk and security are not merely technical checkpoints. They are foundational management responsibilities, represented by APO 12 and APO 13. Managing risk involves identifying threats to the enterprise and quantifying exactly how much exposure the organization is willing to accept. This is a critical discussion to have with leadership, as you cannot protect everything with the same level of intensity without stifling the business. Similarly, managing security requires us to build a defense-in-depth strategy that protects our information assets throughout their entire lifecycle. Security strategy is about trade-offs. It's about balancing agility against protection in a way that aligns with the overall risk appetite of the firm. Both domains demand a rigorous approach that moves beyond simple patching to encompass the entire cultural and procedural environment of the enterprise. Finally, we must consider the human elements, such as human resources and relationship management within the context of these objectives. An enterprise could have the best technology strategy in the world, but if the people implementing it lacks the necessary competencies, the plan will inevitably fail. APO mandates that we align our talent acquisition and training programs with the goals set out in our architectural and strategic plans. We need people who understand both the business requirements and the technological possibilities. The goal of this domain is to create a well-oiled machine where the structure, the strategy, the architecture, and the human resources act in concert to achieve the enterprise goals. By focusing on these 14 objectives, you ensure that the enterprise's IT organization is not just functional, but intentionally designed for success. See you in the next lesson. Welcome back. In this session, we will examine the build, acquire, and implement domain, which centers on realizing the vision defined by governance through practical engineering and operational integration. The build, acquire, and implement domain, often abbreviated as BAI, represents the phase where enterprise investment turns into tangible technical solutions. While other domains might focus on strategy or operations, This domain is strictly concerned with the life cycle of technology assets. It acts as the bridge between the design of a solution and its successful deployment into the production environment. We focus here on how requirements are transformed into functional builds and how those builds are transitioned into services. If we ignore this domain, we risk disconnected development cycles and poorly integrated infrastructure components, which ultimately undermines the entire governance system. By managing these 11 objectives, an enterprise ensures that projects are not just completed on time, but that they meet the business requirements established in earlier stages. We need a rigorous approach to ensure that what we build is what the organization actually requires to achieve its goals. Managed Programs and Projects, known as BAI01, sets the stage for success by establishing a structured environment for investment. It is not sufficient to simply complete a set of tasks. One must align these tasks with a portfolio of investments. This requires constant tracking of capital and operational expenses to verify that the return on investment remains valid throughout the development lifecycle. When we look at BAI02, the focus shifts to the definition of requirements, which is often where the most significant risks originate. If the requirements are not clearly understood or documented, the technical solution will fail to deliver value, regardless of the quality of its engineering. Defining these requirements requires collaboration between technical teams and business stakeholders to ensure that the scope remains aligned with enterprise goals. A clear requirement becomes the benchmark against which we measure success, making it the bedrock of our software development lifecycle. Moving into BAI3, which covers the identification and build of solutions, we enter the realm of actual engineering and procurement. This objective demands that we manage the design, development, and testing phases with precision, ensuring that the software or infrastructure integrates with existing enterprise architecture. Every build activity must be governed by policies that dictate how code is promoted, how testing environments are mirrored, and how vendor relationships are managed during the acquisition process. Building a house is a good analogy. You must ensure the foundation matches the blueprints before you invest in the interior finishings. If we fail to control this process, we end up with technical debt in systems that do not interoperate effectively. This involves managing the specific components that make up the solution while keeping track of configuration assets that determine how the system behaves once deployed. Transitioning into operations brings us to BAI06 and BAI07, which address change management and the final acceptance of technical changes. Change management is frequently misunderstood as merely a bureaucratic hurdle, but within the COBIT framework, it is the primary control mechanism for minimizing service disruption. When we plan an IT change, we must evaluate the potential impact on all related configuration items and business services. BAI07 focuses on the transition process, ensuring that the necessary rigor is applied before a solution goes live. This includes testing for operational readiness and ensuring that the support teams are adequately trained to manage the new system. Without this transition phase, even a technically perfect system can fail due to a lack of alignment with operational realities. We must treat every deployment as a controlled event that includes validation and verification of compliance with security and business requirements. The cumulative effect of these BAI processes is a predictable delivery of technical value that supports the broader enterprise strategy. When you successfully manage the requirements definition, you have a traceable path for every line of code or infrastructure component. When you govern configuration assets, you prevent the drift that often occurs in complex, long-running environments. Managing changes and transitions ensures that the business is never surprised by technical failures or stability issues during a release. This domain is fundamentally about turning the abstract goals established by governance into concrete, maintainable assets. By focusing on these specific objectives, you elevate the IT organization from a chaotic responsive unit to a disciplined engineering function. Your ability to map these technical processes back to the core principles of COBIT will be central to mastering this domain for the foundation exam. We'll see you in our next session. Welcome back. In this lesson, we are going to explore the deliver, service, and support domain, which focuses on the operational execution of technology services. The deliver, service, and support domain, or DSS, captures the heartbeat of your enterprise technology operations. While governance sets the strategic direction and management objectives define the architecture, it is within this domain that the actual services are provided to the business. We are looking at the daily execution lifecycle, ensuring that the IT infrastructure performs as expected and that users receive the support they require. This is inherently pragmatic. It is where the abstractions of high-level management meet the reality of server uptime, help desk tickets, and security patches. By mastering these objectives, you gain a structured approach to maintaining operational stability and continuity amidst the chaos of day-to-day IT work. We begin our technical inspection with DSS-01, which is Managed Operations. This objective is not simply about keeping the lights on, but about executing the operational procedures required for delivering IT services. It demands that we define and implement formal operational procedures while monitoring output to ensure they match internal expectations. Think of this as the equivalent of maintaining a clean build pipeline in software development. Without consistent operational practices, the reliability of our output degrades rapidly. You must focus on task scheduling and system monitoring, which are the essential components that allow an organization to move from reactive firefighting to proactive management of the production environment. Moving into DSS-02, we encounter managed service requests and incidents, which is perhaps the most visible portion of the DSS domain from the end-user perspective. The goal here is to provide timely, effective responses to user requests and incident reports while minimizing the impact on productivity. A service request is a planned interaction, like a password reset, while an incident is an unplanned interruption to service. COBIT emphasizes that the classification and prioritization of these items are critical, as not all disruptions warrant the same resource allocation. By establishing a clear life cycle for every ticket, we ensure that incidents are resolved according to established service-level agreements, and that reporting is used for trend analysis. Effective incident management naturally leads us to DSS-03, Manage Problems. While an incident is the current symptom, the problem is the underlying root cause that likely generates a recurring stream of incidents. The objective here is to identify and classify these root causes and provide resolutions to prevent future interruptions. In a mature environment, this implies a feedback loop where unresolved incidents are analyzed to determine systemic weaknesses. If you observe the same server failing every week under a specific load pattern, you are not just managing incidents. You are managing a problem that requires structural modification to your architecture rather than mere restarts. Business continuity, covered under DSS-04, managed continuity, is often misunderstood as merely having a backup of your primary database. COBIT takes a broader view here, requiring that we maintain, test, and execute a plan that keeps business processes running during and after a significant disruption. This objective mandates that you define the business requirements for continuity and verify that the infrastructure can indeed meet those requirements under stress. I find it useful to think of this as a defensive programming practice for the entire enterprise. Just as you would design a system to handle a network timeout gracefully without corrupting state, an organization must design its operational continuity to handle unplanned site closures or catastrophic infrastructure failures. Security is the central theme of DSS-05, known as Managed Security Services, which aims to protect enterprise technology assets and system integrity. This covers the entire gamut of security, including physical access controls and logical security within the software environment. The focus is on implementing identity and access management, protecting against malicious software, and managing the vulnerabilities inherent in your third-party components. You cannot outsource responsibility. You must ensure that security processes are integrated into the daily workflow of the operations team. In practice, this means constant vigilance and the application of granular security controls to ensure that only authorized users access sensitive system resources. Finally, we address DSS-06, Managed Business Process Controls. This objective ensures that the information processed by our technology systems remains accurate, complete, and valid. It is the bridge between the IT controls we implement and the business requirements for reliable information processing. If your system performs a transaction, you must demonstrate that the data has not been tampered with or corrupted during its journey through the application stack. This creates a chain of custody for information, similar to how we might ensure immutability in an event-driven architecture. By defining clear process owners and embedding automated checks at critical points, we maintain the integrity of business data throughout its lifecycle. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Today, we shift our focus to the final core domain of the COBIT 2019 framework, which deals with how we verify that our enterprise governance is actually functioning as intended. We will explore the monitor, evaluate, and assess domain, commonly referred to as EA, and break down its four specific management objectives. The heart of the MEA domain is the objective of Managed Performance and Conformance Monitoring, or MEA-01, which establishes the necessary feedback loops for effective governance. In any complex system, we cannot simply design a policy or process and assume it remains effective over time, as internal and external conditions inevitably shift. This objective requires us to define specific metrics that allow us to track whether our enterprise is meeting its targets while adhering to its defined policies. By gathering performance evidence, we gain the transparency needed to identify gaps between planned outcomes and actual results. Think of this as the dashboard in a vehicle that tells you not just your speed, but whether your engine is operating efficiently enough to reach your destination on time. If you lack the measurement mechanism to trigger an alert when performance drops, you essentially have no way to know if your governance system is failing until a disaster occurs. Consequently, MEA-01 demands a structured approach to performance measurement that translates operational data into insights for decision makers. Moving into the second objective, MEA-02, we encounter the managed system of internal control, which focuses on the continued effectiveness of the controls we have implemented. Where the previous objective looks at broad performance metrics, this one zooms in on the specific technical or procedural guardrails that prevent errors and fraud. We must execute regular self-assessments to determine whether these controls are still appropriate for the current threat landscape. If an organization implements an access control policy but never tests if those controls actually prevent unauthorized individuals from entering a system, the policy is merely a suggestion. Systematic monitoring here ensures that the control environment evolves alongside the risks it seeks to mitigate. We establish an ongoing process of control monitoring to provide management with the assurance that their risk appetite is being respected on a day-to-day basis. This creates a culture of accountability where the existence of a control is not treated as a box to be checked, but as a live, functional component of the business. The third objective, MEA-03, is managed compliance with external requirements, which is perhaps the most rigid aspect of our governance framework due to legal and regulatory pressures. Organizations do not operate in a vacuum, and they are constantly subject to laws, sector-specific regulations, and various contractual obligations that dictate how data and technology must be handled. This objective requires a repeatable process to identify what external requirements apply to the enterprise and to verify that we are indeed meeting them. Failing to manage this specific area leads to tangible risks, such as heavy fines, operational shutdowns, or the loss of trust from our clients. We must maintain a mapping between external requirements and our internal practices, so that when a law changes, we can quickly determine which processes require modification. This is not just about avoiding legal trouble. It is about providing the evidence required by external regulators during an audit. Verification through audits confirms that the rhetoric of our compliance matches the reality of our technical implementation. Finally, we arrive at MEA-04, which is the managed assurance objective focused on the confidence that the governance system provides to stakeholders. While the prior objectives focus on performance and compliance, this one is concerned with the overarching validity and independence of those assessments. It asks the critical question: how do we know that our own reporting is accurate without external confirmation? By managing assurance, the enterprise organizes both internal and external audits, creating a layer of skeptical, independent review that validates the integrity of the information provided to the board. Without this objective, an organization risks falling into a trap of confirmation bias, where performance is only measured by those with a vested interest in a positive outcome. We leverage assurance reports to identify internal weaknesses that might have been overlooked by day-to-day operational management. Ultimately, this domain serves as the final filter for the enterprise, ensuring that governance is not just a theoretical framework, but a reliable, verifiable, and constantly improving reality. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome to the module on Governance System Components, where we will examine the structural pillars that bring the COBIT 2019 framework to life. We will specifically focus on the 7 categories that serve as the building blocks for an effective enterprise governance system. In COBIT 2019, the architecture of a governance system is not merely a theoretical construct, it is a practical arrangement of components designed to deliver value. You can think of these components as the specific tools and infrastructure required to transform governance intentions into measurable outcomes. Historically, these were referred to as enablers, but the nomenclature has shifted to components to better reflect their role as modular parts of a larger machine. When we discuss them, we must acknowledge that they do not operate in a vacuum, but rather function as an integrated set that interacts to satisfy stakeholder needs. If you ignore or misconfigure one of these components, the chain of governance is inevitably weakened, often leading to systemic failure, even if the other parts remain robust. Mastering these 7 categories is therefore essential for anyone tasked with designing or auditing an enterprise information and technology system. The first category involves the processes and structures that define the organizational anatomy. Processes represent the set of practices and activities needed to achieve specific objectives, while structures are the organizational entities that hold responsibility for those activities. Another critical component is the set of principles, policies, and frameworks, which act as the rules of engagement for the enterprise. Without clear policies that are effectively communicated throughout the organization, decisions become erratic and inconsistent with top-level goals. We also must consider information as an essential component in its own right, as it constitutes the lifeblood of decision-making. If the information flowing through your governance system is inaccurate, outdated, or incomplete, the governance outputs will be similarly defective regardless of the sophistication of your processes. Moving beyond the technical or structural, we encounter the cultural and human elements of the system. Culture, ethics, and behavior are components that determine how easily the organization accepts and integrates new governance initiatives. It is a common mistake to focus exclusively on technical structures while ignoring the informal human networks that actually dictate how things get done. Alongside this, we have skills and competencies which ensure that the right human capital is available to execute the governance tasks. A well-designed policy is worthless if the staff lacks the specific proficiency required to carry it out. This highlights the necessity of aligning your architectural governance design with the actual capabilities present in your workforce, as talent gaps will always reveal themselves during implementation. Finally, we must consider the services, infrastructure, and applications that act as the technological backbone of the governance system. This component encompasses the hardware, software, and cloud services that provide the computing environment necessary to support governance objectives. These components are categorized as generic when they appear in the COBIT core model, meaning they apply universally across most organizational contexts. However, they are transformed into specific variants through the use of design factors, which allow you to tailor the system to your unique enterprise needs. By adjusting these specific variants based on factors like the size of the enterprise, its threat landscape, or its reliance on external IT providers, you customize the system to be lean and effective rather than bloated and bureaucratic. Understanding this distinction between the generic core and the tailored variant is the key to passing the exam and implementing COBIT in the real world. I will see you in the next lesson. Welcome back. Today we are delving into 2 fundamental components of the COBIT 2019 governance system: processes and organizational structures. These elements serve as the connective tissue that translates abstract governance objectives into tangible, operational reality within an enterprise. In the COBIT framework, a process is defined as a series of activities designed to transform specific inputs into defined outputs, thereby achieving a purposeful objective. Think of this as a structured recipe where specific data or events enter the system and, through a set of documented practices, move toward a state of predictable completion. Every process within the core model includes a set of practices that are necessary to generate the required outcomes of a governance or management objective. Because these processes do not exist in a vacuum, they must possess clear entry and exit criteria to ensure that the work remains within the boundaries of organizational intent. When we discuss process implementation, we are essentially discussing the creation of reliable mechanisms that turn strategic directives into repeatable activity. Without this formalization, activities remain ad hoc, leaving the enterprise vulnerable to inconsistency, audit failure, and resource wastage. Effective processes must be measurable, allowing the enterprise to assess whether the outputs genuinely align with the needs defined in the earlier goals cascade. If processes provide the methodology for action, organizational structures provide the framework for authority and accountability. These structures are the entities or individuals tasked with the execution, oversight, and decision-making responsibilities that keep the governance system functioning correctly. Within an enterprise, this typically includes the board of directors, executive committees, steering groups, and individual functional departments that possess specific operational mandates. Each structure must have a clear charter that defines its scope, its decision-making power, and its limitations relative to other departments. If a committee lacks a formal mandate, it often struggles with ambiguity, leading to delayed decisions or conflict over jurisdiction. Governance requires that we align these structures with the business model so that authority flows logically from the executive level down to the service delivery teams. When you design these structures, you are essentially establishing the control environment where corporate culture meets formal oversight. The intersection of processes and structures is where we utilize the RACI chart, a tool that clarifies the nature of involvement for stakeholders during the life cycle of an objective. In this model, the responsible party is the entity that performs the work or executes the process activity, while the accountable person is the single individual who must ensure the success of the process. It is a critical best practice in COBIT that only one person can be accountable for any given task to avoid the diffusion of responsibility. The consulted party provides input, feedback, or subject matter expertise, effectively shaping the process execution without being responsible for the daily grind. Finally, the informed party is kept updated on progress and results, though they generally do not have the power to steer the process direction directly. By mapping these roles against the governance objectives, the enterprise eliminates the friction caused by unclear expectations and overlapping powers. Applying these concepts correctly requires a disciplined approach to both vertical and horizontal communication within the organization. When a structure is properly empowered, it monitors the process performance to determine if the expected outputs are indeed being achieved. If a process drifts from its intended trajectory, the governing structure must possess the mandate to intervene and direct course corrections. This creates a feedback loop that sustains the alignment between what the enterprise intends to achieve and what its people actually do every day. You should consider whether the existing committees and departments in your own environment have clearly identified RACI assignments for their critical activities. Often, you will find that governance failures are not the result of poor technology, but rather the result of ambiguous mandates and lack of accountability among structural units. Mastering these two components provides you with the control necessary to manage complexity effectively. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lecture, we will dissect the foundational components of principles, policies, and information within the COBIT 2019 governance system. To understand the architecture of enterprise governance, we must first look at how the organization translates its high-level strategic intent into concrete behavioral expectations. Principles act as the bedrock for this translation, establishing the value drivers that influence the design of the entire governance system. A principle is not merely a statement of belief, but a required condition for effective governance, serving as a boundary within which all management decisions must operate. Policies, on the other hand, represent the formalization of these principles into rules that dictate acceptable and unacceptable behavior. When we design a policy, we are essentially codifying the organizational intent into actionable, repeatable patterns of conduct. An effective policy management system does not stop at the publication of a document. It requires a structured life cycle that includes communication, comprehension, and enforcement. If a policy exists in a vacuum, or if it lacks the support of the remaining governance components like structure or culture, it becomes an inert artifact rather than a driver of behavior. Truly effective policies are context-aware, meaning they are tailored to the specific risks and capabilities of the enterprise, ensuring that governance is embedded in the daily work rather than applied as an external constraint. Transitioning to the concept of information, we must treat it with the same rigor we apply to physical or financial assets. In the context of COBIT, information encompasses all data, both structured and unstructured, that an enterprise creates, processes, and consumes to support its business objectives. Throughout its life cycle, from initial creation or acquisition, through its transformation and storage, down to its final destruction or archiving, information must be managed with a focus on its inherent quality and utility. Managing information as an asset requires us to evaluate it against specific attributes such as accuracy, completeness, and consistency, which are foundational to making sound management decisions. If the quality of the information is poor, the governance objectives served by that information will inevitably erode. We also look at the structural properties of information, which determines how data is organized and how metadata is applied to ensure that information is accessible and usable at the right time. When we discuss operational control, we are referencing the ability of the enterprise to maintain the integrity of its information assets across decentralized business units. Ultimately, information is the lifeblood of the organization, providing the feedback loop necessary for the governance system to adapt and thrive. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Today, we are shifting our focus to the human element within corporate governance, specifically examining how culture, ethics, and behavior dictate the efficacy of any structural framework. When we construct sophisticated governance architectures, we often fall into the trap of viewing the organization as a machine governed by rigid processes and logical flows. However, governance does not exist in a vacuum. It operates through the decisions and actions of real people who possess their own values, biases, and inherent motivations. If a governance framework is technically sound but culturally misaligned, it will inevitably face resistance that manifests as silent workarounds or overt noncompliance. COBIT 2019 recognizes this by elevating culture, ethics, and behavior to a core component of the governance system. Without addressing this human dimension, even the most meticulous documentation ends up as shelfware, ignored by the very personnel it is intended to guide. To align enterprise objectives with daily operations, we must acknowledge that culture is the underlying operating system that governs how employees interact with the rules we set. Organizations often fail to implement governance because they attempt to force behaviors that contradict the prevailing organizational culture. Culture can be defined as the collective set of values, beliefs, and attitudes that shape the standard operating behavior of an entity. If you introduce a framework requiring stringent risk reporting in a culture that punishes transparency, you will find that employees bury risks to protect their personal standing. Ethics act as the moral compass for this culture, serving as the foundation upon which trust is constructed between leadership and staff. When ethical standards are clearly articulated and, more importantly, modeled by senior management, they create a safe psychological space. This environment is essential for open risk communication, which is a requirement for effective governance. A system that ignores the ethical climate will find that internal controls are easily bypassed by employees who prioritize short-term results over long-term compliance. To bridge the gap between policy and practice, we must design incentives that reinforce the behavior we wish to encourage. Governance initiatives frequently struggle because the existing incentive structures, such as performance bonuses or career progression, reward behavior that is antithetical to internal control. For example, if an organization pushes for rapid build, acquire, and implement cycles, but fails to incentivize security and quality assurance, developers will naturally prioritize speed over secure coding practices. We must ensure that the behaviors demanded by our governance objectives are reflected in the compensation and recognition systems of the company. When an employee perceives that adhering to the governance framework provides personal value or contributes directly to organizational success, the friction of implementation decreases significantly. Aligning these incentives requires a granular understanding of what motivates the workforce, moving beyond simple compliance checklists to meaningful behavioral reinforcement. Identifying cultural friction points is a primary responsibility for anyone tasking themselves with system design. These friction points typically appear where the proposed governance requirements clash with current work habits or deeply held organizational beliefs. A common example is the transition from a siloed, competitive environment to one requiring cross-functional collaboration and accountability. When individuals feel that their autonomy is being eroded by new bureaucratic layers, they will innovate ways to subvert the process. Instead of viewing this resistance as mere stubbornness, use it as a diagnostic tool to understand where your governance design is misaligned with the workflow. Facilitating an open dialogue about these friction points allows management to adjust structures so that they support rather than hinder the workforce. The goal is to make the desired governance behavior the path of least resistance for every employee. Ultimately, individual behavior is the aggregate result of personal values, organizational culture, and incentive structures working in concert. Implementing a framework like COBIT is not merely about changing workflows. It is about steering the culture toward an environment where governance is viewed as an enabler of quality. This requires authentic leadership that walks the talk, ensuring that the policies written in an office are consistent with the reality of the front line. When an organization succeeds in aligning behavior with its articulated values, the governance system ceases to be a burden and becomes the natural way of doing business. It is a long-term investment that requires patience and a willingness to adjust the design when it fails to produce the expected behavioral outcomes. Governance, at its heart, is a human endeavor that mandates constant vigilance regarding how people perceive, interpret, and respond to the rules we establish. I look forward to discussing how these concepts interface with our next topic. Welcome back to our exploration of the COBIT governance system components. In this session, we will examine the critical role of people, skills, and competencies in achieving governance goals. Governance is not an abstract exercise performed in a vacuum, but rather a practical activity that relies entirely on human capability. Without the right people possessing the necessary skills, even the most sophisticated governance frameworks will fail to materialize into tangible business value. We must recognize that governance and management objectives cannot be executed unless there is a clear understanding of the human resources required to perform those tasks. Whether it is a technical operation, a risk assessment, or a high-level strategic decision, each action demands a specific set of competencies. When we discuss skills and competencies within the COBIT context, we are essentially talking about the engine that drives your enterprise architecture. If that engine lacks the required parts, or if those parts are misaligned with the intended speed and direction, the system will inevitably stall. As architects of a governance system, our task is to ensure that the human infrastructure is just as robust as our technical infrastructure. The first step in addressing this component involves systematically identifying the capabilities needed for every role within the organization. We start by mapping governance and management processes to the specific duties they entail, which naturally reveals the knowledge, attitudes, and behaviors required for success. This is not merely about technical certification. It encompasses a broader range of professional skills, including analytical thinking and regulatory awareness. Once these needs are explicitly defined, we move into the phase of building those capabilities. This might involve formal training paths, mentorship programs, or structural changes to job descriptions to ensure they reflect current technological realities. The alignment between human resource planning and emerging technological architectures is particularly vital in the modern era, where technical debt often arises from a mismatch between changing tools and stagnant skill sets. By keeping these two streams synchronized, we minimize the friction that occurs during digital transformations. Tracking competence is the ongoing maintenance that prevents the degradation of your governance system over time. We utilize competence assessment tools to gain an objective view of where the organization currently stands compared to where it needs to be. These assessments provide quantitative data that allows leadership to make informed decisions regarding talent acquisition, retention, and development. If the assessment reveals a significant deficit in a critical area, such as cybersecurity risk management, the organization must prioritize targeted professional development or strategic hiring. Furthermore, this component encourages a culture where professional growth is treated as a strategic necessity rather than a discretionary expense. By optimizing training paths, we ensure that employees are not only capable of performing their current tasks, but are also prepared to handle the evolving requirements of the business. This deliberate approach creates a resilient workforce that can adapt to new challenges while remaining firmly aligned with the broader principles of COBIT. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back to our exploration of the COBIT 2019 governance system components. In this session, we turn our attention to the foundational layer of services, infrastructure, and applications. When we discuss the governance of enterprise information and technology, it is all too easy to become lost in the abstract world of policies, frameworks, and organizational goals. However, these governance systems must eventually manifest in the physical and logical realities that power an organization's daily operations. Services, infrastructure, and applications represent the tangible technology foundation upon which all other governance activities rely. Without these components, an enterprise would lack the processing capabilities required to execute its business strategy or deliver value to its stakeholders. Consider infrastructure as the bedrock, comprised of servers, storage systems, and the underlying network fabric that connects disparate parts of the organization. Applications act as the specialized tools that transform raw data into actionable information, while services define the accessible interfaces and operational routines that allow the business to utilize those tools. Governing these assets means moving beyond mere technical management and ensuring that these resources are actively contributing to the achievement of enterprise goals. To govern these technology components effectively, we must first recognize that they exist to serve the enterprise's strategy rather than existing for their own sake. An enterprise architecture approach is essential here, as it provides the roadmap for how infrastructure and applications are integrated to support organizational objectives. Availability is the primary concern for most infrastructure. If the network or the server environment is offline, the governance system fails in its duty to support continuous business operations. Security acts as the protective wrapper around these components, ensuring that sensitive data is shielded from unauthorized access while maintaining the integrity of the underlying systems. Scalability is equally critical, as the technology stack must be able to adapt to sudden changes in business demand without requiring a complete overhaul of the existing structure. Governance ensures that these three pillars, availability, security, and scalability, are not treated as optional add-ons, but are deeply embedded into the life cycle of every technological asset. When we talk about services, we are effectively discussing the abstraction of technical complexity, providing business units with a reliable and predictable way to interact with the underlying hardware and software. The complexity of modern enterprise environments, particularly with the proliferation of cloud, hybrid architectures, and shadow IT, makes the governance of these components increasingly challenging. You must ensure that every piece of software deployed, whether it is a legacy enterprise application or a new microservice developed in-house, adheres to the established policy framework. This is not about stifling innovation, but about establishing a baseline of quality and control that prevents technical debt from accumulating to the point of collapse. When an organization neglects the governance of its infrastructure, it often finds itself trapped in a cycle of reactive firefighting, where resources are wasted on patching cracks rather than building forward-looking value. A robust governance system for these foundations requires clear definitions of responsibility and accountability, ensuring that those who design the infrastructure understand their role in the broader governance lifecycle. We must also consider the information flows that traverse these applications, as the governance system is ultimately tasked with securing information assets from the moment they are generated until they are retired. By integrating these technical realities into the broader scope of COBIT 2019, we create a feedback loop where the technical performance of services informs executive decision-making. Think of the relationship between governance and the physical infrastructure as a relationship between intention and capability. Management teams might set high-level goals like reaching a new market segment or achieving compliance with global privacy regulations. But these goals remain unreachable if the underlying applications cannot support the required data governance processes. The infrastructure must provide the necessary throughput and resiliency to make those high-level goals a reality under fluctuating conditions. By treating services, infrastructure, and applications as a core component of the governance system, we bridge the gap between technical operations and executive foresight. This component forces us to ask whether our technical investments are actually enabling the business to do what it intends to do. As we move forward in our study, keep in mind that the governance of these components should always be proportionate to their impact on organizational value. You are not just managing servers or writing code. You are configuring the machinery upon which the competitive strategy of the enterprise rests. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome to this new chapter, where we will explore how to tailor your governance system to suit your unique organizational needs. You're about to learn the critical methodology behind customizing COBIT 2019 to ensure your governance efforts are practical and effective. In the world of professional governance, a common mistake is the attempt to apply the entire COBIT framework indiscriminately, as if every organization were a carbon copy of the other. The reality of modern business is that context is everything, and a governance model that works perfectly for a global financial institution will likely become a source of bureaucracy for a smaller, agile software firm. When we talk about tailoring, we are specifically referring to the process of transforming a generic, theoretical reference model into a working, customized solution. This transition is essential because true agility in governance does not come from doing everything, but from doing the right things for your specific environment. Consider a scenario where you are designing a system for a startup working in a highly regulated industry compared to a nonprofit organization. Their risk tolerances, resource constraints, and compliance mandates are fundamentally different. If you force the same set of controls on both, you inevitably end up with either an insecure system or a bloated, unusable one. Tailoring allows you to cut through the noise and identify which governance objectives actually matter to your stakeholders. The high-level methodology of tailoring rests on the understanding that as an organization evolves in scale, shifts its industry focus, or interacts with different regional mandates, its internal control requirements must shift accordingly. You might view the main COBIT framework as a comprehensive catalog, not a checklist of mandatory items that must all be implemented simultaneously. The art of tailoring is essentially the art of selective application, where you evaluate organizational factors like the size of the enterprise, its threat landscape, and its strategic goals to filter the governance objectives. A large enterprise might require a high density of controls to manage disparate departments, while a smaller entity may need to focus almost exclusively on a few critical business outcomes. By utilizing design factors, you effectively define the parameters that dictate which governance and management objectives are prioritized for your specific situation. This ensures that the governance system remains lean, focused on value creation rather than just compliance, and tightly aligned with the strategic direction of the business. You will find that this systematic approach prevents the common pitfall of over-engineering, which is often the silent killer of effective information technology governance. As we proceed through this module, we will explore the mechanisms that enable this level of customization and discuss how to translate these design considerations into a concrete, measurable set of governance objectives. This is where you transform the abstract concepts of the book into a tangible framework that your colleagues will actually adopt and appreciate. By mastering this tailoring process, you are essentially learning how to bridge the gap between rigorous industrial standards and the messy human reality of everyday operations. We will examine how to weigh various organizational forces to ensure that your final governance design is sustainable and responsive. This foundational knowledge is what separates an effective governance professional from a theoretical academic, and it is a skill that scales with your career. We are not just talking about checking boxes. We're talking about building a structure that supports business success while maintaining necessary oversight. I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson. Welcome back. In this lesson, we begin our exploration of the critical design factors that allow us to tailor a COBIT 2019 governance system to the specific needs of an organization. Design Factor 1 focuses on the enterprise strategy. Organizations do not operate in a vacuum, and their governance systems must reflect their underlying business models, whether they prioritize growth, innovation, or cost leadership. When a company adopts a growth strategy, the governance system must remain flexible enough to support rapid scaling and new market entry, often at the expense of rigid bureaucratic controls. Conversely, a cost leadership strategy demands a governance system that emphasizes efficiency, standardization, and the elimination of redundant processes to preserve margins. By identifying the primary strategic theme, we can better align our governance objectives to support business outcomes rather than viewing governance as an administrative burden. This alignment ensures that our IT infrastructure and management practices work in unison with corporate goals, thereby facilitating success instead of acting as a bottleneck. Moving to Design Factor 2, we address enterprise goals. The COBIT 2019 Goals Cascade provides the necessary scaffolding to translate high-level business requirements into actionable governance and management objectives. Enterprise goals represent the desired outcomes for the organization, ranging from financial transparency to regulatory compliance and operational agility. By mapping these specific enterprise goals through the established Goals Cascade, we identify which specific governance objectives are most critical for the organization. This process prevents the common mistake of treating all IT objectives as equally important, which leads to diluted focus and wasted resources. Instead, we use the enterprise goals to prioritize our efforts, ensuring that every governance activity directly contributes to a stated business requirement. Design Factor 3 concerns the enterprise risk profile. Every organization operates within a landscape of uncertainty, and understanding how net risk exposure impacts governance choices is fundamental to a mature system. We must evaluate various risk categories, such as IT investment failure, project delays, or security breaches, to determine the level of oversight required. By quantifying these risk exposures, we can determine whether specific governance processes need to be enhanced to provide greater control or if they can remain at a standard level. A higher risk profile requires more robust monitoring and more frequent reporting, while lower risk areas may allow for a more streamlined, lower cost management approach. The goal here is to balance the cost of control against the potential impact of risk, ensuring that we are not over-governing low-risk activities while neglecting critical danger points. The fourth design factor shifts our attention to INT-related issues. This is essentially a pragmatic look at the current pain points that the organization faces in its daily technology operations. When we map existing issues, such as poor software performance, lack of integration between platforms, or data quality concerns, directly to our governance framework, we can select the appropriate management objectives to address those specific shortcomings. Instead of implementing processes for the sake of compliance, we focus on the core issues that are actively preventing the organization from meeting its potential. By addressing these pain points through targeted governance interventions, we turn the governance system into an active problem-solving tool. This approach ensures that our investment in COBIT 2019 yields immediate, observable improvements in operational stability and service delivery performance. See you in the next lesson. Welcome back to our exploration of the COBIT 2019 design factors, where we transition from the strategic enterprise drivers to the operational realities of your environment. In this session, we investigate design factors 5 through 11, which act as the primary filters for tailoring your governance system to specific organizational needs. Starting with design factor 5, the threat landscape. We must recognize that an organization operating in a high-threat environment, such as one handling sensitive financial data or critical infrastructure, necessitates more stringent control measures than a low-risk startup. This requires higher capability levels for management objectives related to information security and incident response. Next, design factor 6, compliance requirements, shifts our focus toward the regulatory pressures imposed on the enterprise, whether they stem from industry standards or legal frameworks like GDPR or HIPAA. When regulatory demands are high, the management objectives concerning compliance and legal oversight must be architected with significantly more rigor and validation. These factors emphasize that a one-size-fits-all governance model is statistically likely to fail because it ignores the actual environment in which the enterprise resides. Design factor 7, the role of IT, evaluates whether IT is viewed primarily as a support function, a strategic business partner, or the core product of the enterprise itself. If your organization treats IT as a commodity service, the governance objectives can often remain focused on efficiency and cost containment. Conversely, if IT is the primary driver of value as an innovation center, the management objectives must pivot toward agility, rapid scaling, and proactive research. Moving to design factor 8, the sourcing model for IT, we look at the balance of internal versus outsourced capabilities. Organizations relying on managed services or cloud providers must shift their governance focus from direct execution to oversight and service-level management of third-party vendors. This structural shift highlights that governance is not about doing everything yourself, but rather about ensuring that everything, regardless of the provider, meets the desired performance levels. Design Factor 9 addresses IT implementation methods, questioning whether the enterprise relies on traditional waterfall, iterative agile, or a hybrid DevOps approach. An organization committed to rapid continuous delivery cycles cannot effectively use a governance regime that mandates lengthy, bureaucratic approval processes at every stage of development. The governance system must align its management objectives to support the velocity of these implementation methods without compromising safety. Design Factor 10, the technology adoption strategy, asks whether you are a lead adopter of bleeding-edge tech, a follower who waits for maturity, or a cautious laggard. Adopters of emerging technology naturally accept a higher risk profile, which demands more robust governance systems around innovative research and prototype security. Failing to match your governance maturity to your technology adoption speed creates a discrepancy where your controls either stifle growth or leave your infrastructure dangerously exposed. Finally, Design Factor 11, enterprise size, serves as a significant modifier for management objectives regardless of other technical choices. Smaller enterprises often benefit from flatter, more integrated governance processes, whereas large, distributed global corporations require specialized, decentralized governance structures to remain effective. Scaling a governance framework simply by expanding the number of processes without considering the specific demands of the enterprise footprint is a common mistake that leads to unnecessary overhead. When you synthesize these 7 factors, you develop a nuanced understanding of where your governance system needs to be lean and where it must be heavy. Recognizing these nuances is the core skill expected of any practitioner applying the COBIT 2019 framework in a real-world enterprise architecture. By consciously adjusting your design based on these variables, you move beyond the theoretical baseline and into the realm of actionable, enterprise-specific guidance. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome back. We are now turning our focus to the practical application of COBIT 2019 through the formal design process workflow. This chapter will walk you through the 4 structured phases required to tailor a governance system to the specific needs of your enterprise. Designing a governance system is rarely a linear exercise because the interaction between various design factors often introduces tension into the decision-making process. The workflow is organized into 4 distinct phases that allow a practitioner to move from a high-level strategic understanding down to a granular set of governance objectives. This procedural approach ensures that your governance system remains responsive to enterprise strategy while remaining grounded in the reality of your current risk profile and resource constraints. By following this sequence, you avoid the common trap of implementing a one-size-fits-all governance model that lacks sufficient alignment with your business goals. We treat this as an iterative exercise where each phase informs the next, creating a feedback loop that eventually results in a prioritized and actionable governance plan. Whether you are addressing regulatory requirements or looking to optimize IT performance, this workflow provides the necessary rigor to translate abstract principles into operational reality. In Phase 1, the primary objective is to understand the enterprise context and strategy so that the governance design reflects the actual business environment. You start by identifying the critical design factors, which include the enterprise strategy, the enterprise goals, and the risk profile of the organization. Because every enterprise operates under different environmental constraints, we must map these inputs against the standardized COBIT Goals Cascade to see where existing governance might be failing. This phase is less about changing structures and more about listening to what the enterprise requires from its information and technology investments. Successfully completing this step means you have a clear picture of the current trajectory of the business and the specific challenges that governance must address in the near term. Phase 2 moves us into the mechanics of determining the initial scope of the governance system by filtering the inputs gathered in the previous step. During this phase, you use the design factors to identify the most relevant governance and management objectives from the core COBIT model. It is important to realize that the framework includes more objectives than any single enterprise could reasonably implement simultaneously, so we must prioritize. You essentially create a high-level scoping document that highlights which areas of governance are vital to support the enterprise's primary goals. This is where you begin to see the influence of technical capabilities and organizational size on the overall system design. By determining this initial scope, you set the boundaries for the subsequent refinement phase, ensuring that focus remains on areas with the highest impact on value creation. Once you have an initial scope, Phase 3 requires you to refine the scope of the governance system through a reality check regarding your specific context. This is the stage where you identify any conflicting design factor inputs, as some organizational goals may pull the governance focus in diametrically opposite directions. Identifying these conflicts is essential because it forces stakeholders to explicitly address trade-offs, such as choosing between higher agility and stricter regulatory compliance. You adjust the scoring of the governance objectives based on these constraints, often highlighting the need for specific adjustments to the standard process descriptions. Much like refactoring code, this refinement process removes unnecessary complexity that does not contribute to the enterprise's core objectives. The result is a bespoke governance design that has been pressure tested against the realities of your current culture, current skills, and infrastructure capabilities. The final stage is Phase 4, which is where we conclude the governance system design. This phase culminates in the final set of prioritized governance recommendations that will be presented to leadership for approval. You consolidate all the insights from the previous phases, ensuring that the selected objectives are supported by the appropriate organizational structures and roles. It is at this point that you draft the business case for the governance initiative, providing the justification for the necessary investments in processes or competencies. You aren't just creating a list of objectives, but a cohesive strategy for implementation that takes into account the enterprise's current capability levels. By finalizing the design here, you transition the initiative from an abstract planning exercise into a concrete set of actions that can be measured and managed effectively. This comprehensive workflow ensures that your governance design is not merely a theoretical exercise, but a functional blueprint for success. See you in the next lecture. Hello. In this lesson, we will focus on the practical implementation of the COBIT 2019 Design Toolkit to translate enterprise context into tailored governance objectives. The COBIT 2019 Design Toolkit is essentially an Excel-based decision support system designed to move us from abstract governance principles to a concrete, prioritized set of objectives. When you first open the tool, you are presented with a series of tabs that require inputs regarding your specific enterprise environment. These inputs are structured around the 11 design factors which we have discussed in earlier sessions, such as enterprise strategy, the risk profile, and the threat landscape. By assigning scores and weights to these factors, you are effectively quantifying the qualitative aspects of your organization. The tool then performs a series of internal calculations based on the COBIT core model to determine the appropriate. Welcome to this exploration of the COBIT business case, where we will examine how to translate abstract governance requirements into a compelling financial and strategic narrative. By understanding the components of this document, you will gain the ability to secure executive support for enterprise governance of information and technology initiatives. When we approach the challenge of governance implementation, we often find ourselves speaking a language that does not natively resonate with executive leadership. Boards and C-level stakeholders are naturally preoccupied with profitability, market share, and risk mitigation, rather than the intrinsic beauty of a perfectly designed governance system. A formal business case serves as the bridge between the technical needs of IT and the fiduciary requirements of the organization. If you cannot articulate why an investment in governance directly supports the corporate strategy, you will likely find your initiative stalled or underfunded. This lesson provides the structure needed to construct a professional business case that satisfies the demands of those holding the budget. We will dissect how to quantify the value, assess the risks, and present the metrics that prove success is not just a hope, but a calculated outcome. The foundation of any robust business case starts with a clear statement of the economic value proposition. This is not merely an accounting exercise. It is an analysis of how governance investments align with enterprise goals such as cost optimization or revenue growth. For instance, if your organization is hemorrhaging funds due to inefficient data management or compliance failures, the business case must explicitly link the proposed governance intervention to the recovery or preservation of those funds. You must move away from discussing features and instead focus on outcomes like reduced latency in decision-making or improvements in operational resiliency. Using metrics like improved return on investment or a reduction in the cost of quality demonstrates that you understand the business side of the technical governance equation. By framing the project in these terms, you transform governance from an overhead burden into a strategic asset that actually generates, rather than just consumes, value. Perhaps most critical to the executive suite is the objective assessment of risks, particularly the risk of taking no action at all. Many governance projects fail to launch because they are presented as nice to have enhancements rather than urgent corrective actions. A thorough business case must detail the consequences of status quo, such as potential regulatory penalties, loss of competitive agility, or exposure to cybersecurity threats. When you present this, use concrete data that illustrates the probable impact, both financial and operational, if the identified governance gaps remain unaddressed. This risk-based justification shifts the conversation from a cost discussion to a value protection discussion, which is often where the most significant budgetary allocations are authorized. Your goal is to make the cost of inaction clearly appear significantly higher than the cost of the proposed investment. Beyond the macro benefits, a formal business case must clearly delineate the required resources compared to the expected operational improvements. Executives need to understand the full lifecycle costs, including the initial implementation phase and the ongoing maintenance of the governance system. Break down these requirements into clear categories like personnel, software, infrastructure, and the inevitable time investment from stakeholders across the enterprise. Furthermore, you must define the key performance indicators that will be tracked to measure the success of the investment once implementation begins. These metrics should be tied directly to the goals cascade, such as a reduction in the time it takes to onboard new services or a decrease in audit findings. By setting these expectations early, you build accountability into the project from day one, which fosters greater trust with your executive sponsors. Transparency in resource allocation is essentially a promise of accountability. When you present how much and for what duration resources will be utilized, you are effectively stating that the project is well scoped and manageable. Avoid the temptation to provide vague estimates. Use the COBIT design factors to justify the scale of the investment, explaining why a particular level of maturity is required for your specific enterprise goals. Mentioning how the governance system components, such as organizational structures or information flows, will interact ensures that the executive feels the scope is fully understood. This precision helps in mitigating the fear of scope creep, which is the bane of almost every large governance initiative. When you provide a realistic, evidence-based roadmap, you gain the authority needed to lead the transformation successfully. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. This lesson focuses on the COBIT performance management scheme and the core requirements for measuring governance efficacy. When we talk about the COBIT performance management model, we are essentially looking for a way to translate complex governance objectives into quantifiable metrics. Governance is often perceived as an abstract set of requirements, but without a mechanism to measure success, these requirements remain theoretical. The CPM model provides a systematic way to determine whether a process is merely present or if it is effectively achieving its intended outcome. It establishes a set of rules that allow for reliable and repeatable assessments across the enterprise. By standardizing these measurements, COBIT ensures that internal audits and management reviews speak the same language when assessing the health of a governance system. This is not about administrative overhead. It is about providing the data necessary for informed decision-making at the executive level. The model is intentionally flexible, supporting various assessment methodologies, which means you can apply it regardless of your existing oversight structure. A significant departure in this model is the shift in how we differentiate between capability and maturity. In earlier frameworks, maturity models were often criticized for being overly subjective or focused on a linear progression that ignored real-world complexity. COBIT 2019 addresses this by leveraging concepts from international standards like CMMI, focusing primarily on capability levels. Capability measurements assess how well a specific process or component functions in its current operational context, independent of an arbitrary scale of corporate evolution. This allows an organization to pinpoint precisely where a process is failing to deliver value, rather than simply labeling the organization as having a low maturity score. By evaluating individual components, such as organizational structures or information flows, you gain a granular view of your governance system. This modular approach allows for targeted improvement, where you invest resources only where the capability gap is most critical to the enterprise objectives. To ensure these measurements remain reliable, the CPM maintains a transparent set of requirements that dictate how assessments must be conducted. Consistency is the hallmark of any good governance audit, and this model mandates that results must be repeatable across different teams and timeframes. If two different independent auditors evaluate the same governance objective using the CPM guidelines, they should arrive at essentially the same conclusion. This repeatability is facilitated by well-defined indicators that move beyond anecdotal evidence and into verifiable facts. Whether you are assessing a single service or an entire governance process, the logic remains consistent, preventing the fragmentation of performance data. When you harmonize these performance measurements with global standards like the CMMI, you align your enterprise with broader industry benchmarks. This not only builds trust with external stakeholders, but also highlights internal systemic weaknesses that might otherwise remain opaque. The primary focus, however, remains squarely on the governance system as a whole rather than isolated silos. While we assess specific components to understand their performance, the goal is always to see how these parts contribute to the efficacy of the entire governance ecosystem. Processes are the engine of this system, but they are supported by principles, structures, and information, all of which are subject to the same performance criteria. By assessing these pieces in tandem, the model reveals hidden interdependencies that often cause governance efforts to fail in practice. You might find that a technically capable process is failing simply because the underlying skills or behaviors do not support its application. This holistic view is exactly what differentiates a performative governance framework from one that actually drives measurable value for the enterprise. It is a rigorous, data-driven approach that requires both discipline and a commitment to objective observation. See you in the next lesson. Welcome back to our discussion on COBIT 2019, where today we will shift our focus to the measurement of process capability within an enterprise governance system. In this lesson, we will examine the 6 distinct capability levels that allow us to quantify the maturity and effectiveness of our processes. The COBIT Performance Management Scheme utilizes a capability maturity model based on the ISO IEC 15504 standard, which helps organizations move beyond simple binary assessments. At the foundation, we encounter level 0, known as the incomplete process, which signals that the process is either not implemented or fails to achieve its intended purpose. When a process sits at this level, there is essentially no systematic approach to ensure that the process goals are met, and the lack of standardization creates unpredictable outcomes. It is important to view this as the baseline where the process scope is either undefined or exists only as a series of ad hoc tasks that do not contribute to the broader governance objectives of the enterprise. Organizations should identify processes at this level as high-risk areas because the absence of structure leads to significant variability and a lack of accountability in execution. Moving upward, Level 1 represents the initial or performed process, where the process is implemented and achieves its purpose, albeit in a reactive manner. At this stage, the process is usually performed without much rigor, and outcomes might be unpredictable because the execution depends heavily on individual heroics rather than institutional knowledge. While there is a clear distinction here from Level 0, because the work actually gets done, the lack of defined procedures means that consistency is difficult to maintain over time. As we look at Level 2, or the managed process, we see the transition into a more disciplined environment where the process is planned, monitored, and adjusted. Here, the process is at least represented by a documented policy or work instruction, and the people executing it have the necessary resources and tools to ensure the process remains within defined boundaries. The jump to Level 3, the defined process, represents a significant shift from localized management to an enterprise-wide standard approach. At this level, the process is standardized through organizational policies and procedures, ensuring that it is implemented consistently across different business units or departments. Because the process is now clearly defined and shared, the organization benefits from reduced friction when employees change roles or when new personnel join the team. Moving into Level 4, the quantitative process, we introduce the concept of measurable performance through the use of metrics and statistical data. This is where governance starts to demonstrate its value through objective evidence. The organization gathers data to understand the variations in process performance and can predict future behavior based on historical trends. Finally, level 5, the optimizing process, describes an environment where the process is continuously improved to meet both current and projected business needs. An optimized process is not merely static or repeatable, but is actively scrutinized for potential efficiencies, identifying where automation or process reengineering can provide additional value. In an optimizing environment, the feedback loop from level 4 is used to make strategic decisions that refine the process, ensuring that it remains aligned with the enterprise objectives as external factors shift. When we assess capability, we must look for documented evidence that supports the transition from one level to the next, as relying on anecdotal claims is insufficient for a rigorous governance audit. We must treat these levels as a ladder of maturity, where each step builds upon the foundational stability provided by the previous one. See you in our next technical deep dive. Welcome back. In this session, we will examine the performance management rules specifically for assessing the non-process components within a COBIT 2019 governance system. When we discuss the governance system, we often default to focusing on processes because they are documented, sequential, and relatively easy to measure. However, COBIT 2019 introduces a deliberate shift toward assessing the other components, such as organizational structures, information items, and culture or behavioral attributes. These components are just as critical to the effectiveness of the enterprise as the processes themselves, yet they are often neglected because they are harder to quantify. To build a robust governance system, you must recognize that a process might be well defined on paper, but it will inevitably fail if the culture is resistant or if the underlying information flows are inconsistent. The assessment of these non-process components follows a logic similar to the capability levels used for processes, utilizing standardized criteria to determine their maturity rather than relying on intuition or anecdotal evidence. By applying performance metrics to these areas, you move from a subjective assessment of how things feel to an objective measurement of how the governance system functions in practice. Assessing organizational structures requires us to evaluate whether the roles, committees, and reporting lines established within the enterprise actually function as intended. We must look at whether these structures have clear mandates, whether they possess the authority to make decisions, and whether they maintain proper engagement with stakeholders. If you find a structure that exists as a formal entity but fails to produce actionable decisions, you are identifying a weakness that will inevitably sabotage your governance processes. Effective organizational structures must have formal charters, regular meeting cadences, and evidence of deliberation that translates into institutional guidance. When assessing these, we define metrics based on the frequency of meetings, the clarity of decision-making records, and the level of participation by key executives. If these structures are weak, it does not matter how efficient your processes are, because the oversight mechanism itself is broken, which effectively creates a ceiling on the overall capability of the organization. Turning to information items, we are effectively measuring the quality, availability, and utility of the data that fuels our governance and management decisions. Information is the lifeblood of any governance system, as it provides the basis for monitoring performance and ensuring alignment with enterprise objectives. To assess this component, we look for clarity, accuracy, and timeliness in how information is stored, shared, and consumed across the enterprise. A key metric here is the traceability of information, ensuring that decision-makers can rely on the reports they receive to make strategic choices. If the information component is weak, it often indicates that although data may exist, it is not synthesized in a way that supports effective governance. We assign maturity levels by evaluating whether the information is static and siloed or whether it is dynamic, integrated, and actively used to drive improvements within the system, thereby serving as a foundation for all other components. The most abstract, yet arguably the most influential, component is culture, ethics, and behavior, which often determines the true adoption rate of any governance framework. Assessing this component involves looking for measurable expressions of values, such as the consistent application of ethics policies, the transparency of communication, and the visible commitment of executive leadership. Because culture is soft, we must use proxy indicators like survey results, incident reports involving behavioral breaches, and the consistency of managerial responses to policy violations. When we evaluate this, we are looking for the gap between the stated values of the enterprise and the actual behaviors observed in daily operations. A weak culture can render even the most sophisticated process model useless because employees may find ways to circumvent controls that do not align with their actual incentives or behavioral norms. Setting maturity levels for culture requires a high degree of honesty in evaluating whether the governance environment encourages accountability or merely facilitates box-checking exercises. Identifying weaknesses across these components is essential for a holistic maturity assessment because these elements are deeply interdependent. If an organizational structure lacks clarity, the processes that report into it will struggle to gain traction, regardless of how well those processes are designed. Similarly, when information items are of poor quality, the leadership cannot effectively exercise its monitor, evaluate, and assess responsibilities. By using a consistent performance management approach to evaluate all 7 components of the governance system, you gain a panoramic view of your enterprise's true capabilities. You should always look for the weakest link among these components, as it acts as a constraint on the entire system's performance. Instead of focusing only on technical process improvement, use these assessment criteria to foster a balanced growth strategy. This comprehensive maturity assessment enables you to build a system where structure, information, and culture support, and reinforce each other rather than working in isolation. See you in the next lesson. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will begin our exploration of the COBIT 2019 Implementation Guide and the structured path it provides for deploying governance improvements. Governance is often misunderstood as a static documentation exercise, but effective implementation requires a shift in perspective toward continuous improvement. The COBIT 2019 Implementation Guide provides that much-needed bridge between theoretical framework design and the practical realities of organizational change. When we talk about governance, we are essentially talking about decision rights and accountability, which are inherently human factors. Many organizations fail to see value in governance because they view adoption as a one-off project with a definite start and end date. This mindset misses the fundamental truth that governance must be an organic, systemic process that evolves alongside the enterprise. The guide addresses this by framing implementation as a life cycle, ensuring that the components we design are actually integrated into day-to-day operations. One of the most persistent hurdles in any governance initiative is cultural resistance, which typically stems from a perceived disconnect between governance objectives and business goals. We often see leadership teams treat governance as an IT-only concern, which results in a lack of sustained buy-in that eventually starves the program of resources. By leveraging the COBIT implementation approach, we replace this fragmented thinking with a structured, lifecycle-based strategy that emphasizes behavioral changes over mere procedural updates. This approach requires us to identify potential friction points early and build a business case that clearly articulates the link between governance activities and enterprise outcomes. When leadership views implementation as a continuous program, they are more capable of managing the pacing of change in a way that the organization can digest. This stability is crucial for ensuring that new processes do not just exist as paper artifacts, but genuinely influence how work gets done. The integration between the design guide and the implementation guide is the cornerstone of a successful enterprise governance deployment. While the design guide allows us to tailor the governance system to fit the specific needs of our enterprise factors, the implementation guide ensures those configurations are actually operationalized. It is not enough to simply state the desired state of governance. We need a vehicle to move the organization from its current, often chaotic baseline to the target objective. This transition is iterative by nature, requiring constant feedback loops that allow us to adjust our tactics as the organizational context shifts. We avoid the trap of big bang deployments, favoring incremental gains that provide demonstrable value early in the process. This maintains momentum, prevents stakeholder fatigue, and allows the governance system to mature in alignment with the enterprise's evolving business strategy. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. Today, we are going to explore the structured journey of the 7 implementation phases within the COBIT 2019 framework. Transitioning from theoretical governance to practical application requires a methodical approach that prevents common pitfalls in organizational change. The implementation roadmap is not a linear set of constraints, but rather a life cycle designed to adapt to the specific needs of an enterprise. Throughout this process, three concurrent rings provide the necessary guardrails: change enablement, program management, and continuous improvement. These rings operate simultaneously across all 7 phases to ensure that the governance system remains robust. Change enablement focuses on the human element, ensuring that stakeholders are sufficiently prepared for shifts in behavior. Program management provides the administrative structure and tracking mechanisms required to deliver planned results. Meanwhile, continuous improvement ensures that the governance system matures alongside the evolving enterprise environment. By maintaining this three-dimensional perspective, practitioners avoid the common error of treating implementation as a one-time project rather than an ongoing operational capability. The roadmap begins with Phase 1, which identifies the drivers for change within the organization. This phase is critical because it establishes the business justification for investing in a governance system. Stakeholders must articulate the pain points or strategic goals that necessitate a shift in how enterprise information and technology are governed. Without a clear understanding of the why, subsequent improvement efforts often lose direction in executive support. Once the drivers are established, we move into Phase 2, which asks where we are now. This involves conducting a baseline assessment of the current state of governance and management practices. Assessing the existing maturity level helps identify gaps between current capabilities and performance requirements. This diagnostic insight is vital for defining realistic expectations for improvement, as it prevents the organization from attempting to reach an ideal state without first understanding its current operational reality. Phase 3 transitions to the target state by asking where we want to be. Here, the focus shifts to setting priorities for improvement based on the enterprise's strategic objectives and design factors. This is where the Goals Cascade mechanism comes into play, helping align governance requirements with the broader business strategy. Following this, Phase 4 addresses what needs to be done. We define the specific actions and solution designs necessary to bridge the gap between our current state and the desired target state. This requires a balanced approach to implementing governance components, ensuring they are practical for the organization's unique culture and constraints. By the time we arrive at Phase 5, titled How Do We Get There?, the focus shifts towards the execution of these plans. This is the implementation phase where processes are documented, roles are defined, and organizational changes are operationalized across the enterprise. Final 2 phases ensure that the implemented governance system delivers sustained value and remains resilient. Phase 6, or did we get there, involves measuring the success of our interventions against the goals defined early in the process. We evaluate whether the changes made in the implementation phase have actually resulted in improved performance metrics and desired outcomes. If the metrics don't align with expectations, this phase provides the evidence needed to recalibrate our approach. Finally, Phase 7 asks how we keep the momentum going. Governance is never a finished product in a dynamic enterprise, so this final phase focuses on institutionalizing the improvements. It involves embedding governance practices into the day-to-day culture so that monitoring and optimizing become an instinctive part of the organization's lifecycle. By completing this cycle, the enterprise creates a sustainable foundation for continuous evolution, effectively closing the loop on the implementation program. See you in the next lecture. Welcome back. In this lesson, we will focus exclusively on the tactical and strategic elements required to successfully navigate the COBIT 2019 Foundation Certification Exam. To approach the COBIT 2019 Foundation Exam effectively, you must first understand the structure of the assessment itself. The exam is designed to test your comprehension of the framework's core components, specific governance objectives, and the architectural design factors that allow for enterprise-specific implementation. You have 120 minutes to complete 75 multiple-choice questions, which equates to approximately 96 seconds per question. This is a generous amount of time if you have mastered the material, but it can vanish quickly if you get trapped by verbose question stems or ambiguous phrasing. You should prioritize answering the questions you find straightforward first, marking the more complex scenarios for a second pass. This ensures you secure the easy points early and lowers the cognitive load for the later, more challenging problems. Mastering the exam requires a disciplined approach to identifying the intent behind each question. COBIT questions often test your ability to distinguish between governance and management, as well as your recognition of the 7 governance system components. When you read a question, look for keywords that define the scope, such as whether the scenario relates to the evaluate, direct, and monitor responsibility, or one of the management domains like align, plan, and organize. Pay close attention to negative phrasing, such as questions asking what is not a component or what is not considered a best practice in a given context. These distractors are placed deliberately to catch those who are rushing through the text without analyzing the underlying theory. Always relate the option back to the core principles of the COBIT framework to verify if it aligns with the holistic view expected by ISACA. Understanding the distribution of questions across the domains is a key part of your strategy. While the core model reference provides a complete view of all objectives, the weight of the exam is balanced to reflect the importance of both the goals cascade and the design factors. Expect a significant portion of the exam to evaluate your grasp of the governance system components, as these form the actionable foundation of the framework. You must be comfortable with the relationship between enterprise goals and alignment goals, as these are frequently tested through scenario-based questions. If you find yourself struggling with a specific term, mentally place it within the context of the COBIT product architecture to anchor your reasoning. Consistency in your logic rather than memorization of disjointed facts is the most reliable way to achieve a passing score. Time management strategy during the exam requires a focus on cognitive efficiency. If a question feels overly long, break it down by identifying the subject, the action required, and the environment being described. Often, the introductory text in a long scenario is contextual filler, and the actual question can be answered by applying a single principle related to the governance system. If you find your progress slowing down, take a deep breath and clear your head before tackling the next section. Sitting in front of a screen for 2 hours while processing complex technical information is exhausting. So maintaining a steady, calm rhythm is as important as the depth of your knowledge. Always double-check your answers if you have remaining time, but avoid second-guessing yourself unless you find a clear contradiction in your previous reasoning. Successful navigation of this exam is not about guessing. It is about applying a structured, systems-thinking mindset to the governance challenges presented in the questions. By internalizing the relationship between design factors and the components of the governance system, you can eliminate incorrect options with high confidence. Remember that every correct answer is a reflection of the COBIT 2019 framework philosophy, which emphasizes a tailored, adaptable approach to governance. Rely on the definitions provided in the official core publications rather than your own previous professional experience, which might be biased towards specific, less comprehensive organizational practices. Trust your preparation. Approach each question with a systematic method, and remember that deep understanding will always outweigh simple rote memorization when it comes to passing this exam. I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome to our concluding session where we bring together the entirety of the COBIT 2019 framework into a cohesive mental model. We have traversed a significant technical landscape, and now is the time to synthesize these elements into a practical roadmap. Building a functional governance system starts with acknowledging the distinction between governance and management. Governance ensures that stakeholder needs, conditions, and options are evaluated to determine balanced, agreed-upon enterprise objectives. Management, conversely, plans, builds, runs, and monitors activities in alignment with the direction set by the governance body. When we examined the 6 governance system principles and 3 framework principles, we were establishing the criteria for what success looks like in a digital enterprise. These principles serve as the bedrock upon which the governance system is constructed, ensuring that it remains dynamic and relevant to the specific needs of the organization. The Goals Cascade remains one of the most critical mechanisms for translating high-level stakeholder requirements into actionable objectives. By flowing stakeholder drivers down through enterprise goals and finally to alignment goals, you create a direct line of sight between corporate strategy and specific IT-related outcomes. This process is supported by the 40 governance and management objectives, which provide the structural integrity for the entire model. These objectives are grouped into the well-known domains of evaluate, direct, and monitor, as well as align, plan, and organize. Integrating these into your practice requires an understanding of how they interact within the larger governance system architecture. We also explored the operational side through the 7 components of a governance system, which range from processes and organizational structures to culture, ethics, and behavior. These components do not exist in a vacuum. They must be tailored using the 11 design factors to ensure the system is fit for purpose. Design factors such as enterprise strategy, risk profile, and threat landscape act as the variables that shift the focus of your implementation. By utilizing the design process workflow, you move from a generic framework to a customized solution that addresses the specific environmental complexities of your organization. Mastering this tailoring process is exactly what differentiates a theoretical understanding from an effective practitioner. Performance management rounds out our knowledge, introducing the CMMI-based capability level scales that help you quantify the maturity of your governance processes. Measuring performance is not about vanity metrics. It is about providing empirical evidence that your governance system is yielding the intended value. As you transition from the theoretical study of these phases to the practical implementation cycle, remember that this is an iterative process. You must continuously monitor, evaluate, and assess the system to ensure it keeps pace with technological advancements and shifting business requirements. Consistency in applying these measurement principles will be your most reliable tool for driving continuous improvement. At this stage, your technical foundation is solid, and you are prepared to engage with the formal certification process. To progress toward the official ISACA exam, navigate to the ISACA portal and ensure you secure your examination window well in advance. This allows for dedicated final review cycles focused on your specific weaker areas identified during practice. Once you achieve your foundation status, you might consider the COBIT 2019 Design and Implementation credential to further specialize. This advanced path provides the depth required to lead complex governance transformations in real-world settings. Take a moment to review the foundational concepts one last time before scheduling your assessment. I wish you success with your examination.